Welcome, weary souls who seek solace in the shadows of the supernatural, to a realm where humanity's deepest fears take corporeal form and nightmares walk among us with malevolent purpose. Tonight, we descend into the comprehensive catalogue of every special grade cursed spirit that has plagued the world of Jujutsu sorcery. Entities born from collective terror and individual anguish that have transcended mere imagination to become forces capable of reshaping reality itself. These are the creatures that exist at the apex of cursed hierarchy, manifestations so powerful that even the strongest sorcerers approach them with reverence and dread. Close your eyes, let your breathing synchronize with the ebb and flow of cursed energy that permeates all existence, and allow yourself to drift into comfortable darkness as we explore the beautiful and terrible truth that our greatest horrors are reflections of our own souls made manifest in supernatural flesh. The story of love transformed into the most powerful curse begins not in darkness, but in the golden light of childhood innocence, where two young hearts beat in perfect harmony, unaware that their bond would one day transcend death itself and reshape the fundamental understanding of what cursed spirits could become. Rika Orimoto lived her brief mortal existence as a beacon of pure affection and joy, her laughter echoing through elementary school hallways like music that made even the saddest moments bearable for those fortunate enough to know her gentle spirit. She was 11 years old when fate chose her for transformation beyond human comprehension, a girl whose greatest crime was loving someone so completely that even death could not sever the connection between their souls. Her friendship with Yuta Okotsu had blossomed with the natural ease that characterized relationships formed before the world taught children to guard their hearts against inevitable disappointment and loss. Two spirits, recognizing kinship at levels deeper than conscious understanding. The promise ring that she gave to Yuta on that final day was not mere childhood sentiment, but a covenant that would prove stronger than every force that sought to separate them. A circle of metal that became the anchor point for emotions so intense they warped the very fabric of reality around their expression. She spoke of marriage with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a future that did not include the person she loved most, unaware that her words were weaving bonds that would persist beyond the grave. The intersection where her human story ended and her cursed existence began was marked by nothing more dramatic than a moment of inattention. A driver whose momentary distraction transformed ordinary Tuesday afternoon into cosmic tragedy that would echo through the Jujutsu world for years to come. The impact that crushed her small body released something far more dangerous than the kinetic energy of collision. It unleashed love so profound and desperate that it rejected every natural law governing life and death. The curse that manifested from Rika's destruction was not born from malice or hatred, but from devotion so absolute that it refused to accept the finality of physical separation, her spirit clinging to existence through sheer force of emotional attachment that proved stronger than cosmic order itself. The little girl who had promised eternal companionship found a way to keep that promise despite the complete destruction of the body that had housed her consciousness for 11 brief years. Her initial manifestations around Yuta were protective rather than predatory, a loving spirit attempting to shield the boy she cared about from every harm that threatened his welfare, unaware that her supernatural intervention was creating isolation more complete than any physical barrier could achieve. The children who fled from Yuta were responding not to his personal characteristics, but to the presence of something vast and terrible that hovered around him like a storm system that could unleash devastation at any moment. The power that Rika wielded in her cursed form was not merely overwhelming but fundamentally different from every other supernatural force that Jujutsu society had catalogued and attempted to understand. Raw, cursed energy that existed at levels that made classification systems inadequate for describing her true capabilities. Her strength was not technique-based but emotional, drawing from reservoirs of feeling that had been concentrated and purified through the trauma of untimely death and desperate attachment. The Jujutsu higher-ups who debated her classification and the threat she represented understood immediately that they were dealing with something unprecedented in their institutional memory, a cursed spirit whose power approached or exceeded that of legendary figures whose names were whispered in the deepest archives. The fact that even Satoru Gojo's ability to contain her was questioned spoke to capabilities that transcended normal categories of supernatural threat and defensive response. But perhaps most remarkably, Rika's manifestation retained essential characteristics of the child she had been, her protective instincts and fundamental goodness unchanged by transformation into something that existed beyond normal human comprehension. The arms that could tear through reinforced barriers with casual ease were the same arms that had once embraced Yuta in comfort, supernatural strength, serving purposes that remained rooted in love rather than conquest or destruction. The progression of her abilities as Yuta developed greater conscious control over their connection demonstrated that power without technique could achieve effects that no amount of training or study could replicate. Her cursed energy blasts possessing devastation potential that made elaborate strategic planning irrelevant when facing opponents who lacked comparable raw strength. The eye beam that annihilated Geto's maximum Uzumaki of 1,000 cursed spirits was delivered with the casual authority of someone swatting away insects that dared to threaten what she protected. The Queen of Curses designation that she earned was not administrative convenience, but accurate description of someone whose capabilities placed her in a category unto herself, ruling not through political maneuvering or strategic alliance, but through the simple fact that no other cursed spirit could match the intensity of emotion that sustained her existence. Her throne was built not from ambition but from devotion that had achieved perfect expression through supernatural means. The bond that connected her to Yuta was not merely symbiotic but transformative for both participants, allowing him to channel power that should have been impossible for someone with his limited training, while providing her with conscious direction that prevented her protective instincts from causing indiscriminate destruction. Their partnership demonstrated that the strongest techniques emerged not from individual mastery but from perfect trust between consciousness and power. Through Rika's connection, Yuta gained access to abilities that defied normal understanding of how cursed energy functioned, her infinite reservoir supplementing his developing techniques, while her willingness to serve as conduit allowed him to copy and utilize powers that belonged to entirely different categories of supernatural ability. She became both weapon and shield, offensive capability and defensive barrier, tactical asset and emotional support, in combinations that made traditional combat analysis inadequate for predicting their effectiveness. The cursed tools and weapons that she could provide demonstrated mastery over materialization that exceeded even ancient techniques for creating supernatural armaments. Her ability to manifest exactly what was needed in any situation, reflecting understanding of combat that transcended formal training or strategic study. These were not merely physical objects, but extensions of her were made tangible. Tools that adapted to circumstances with fluid precision. Despite power that could reshape battlefields and eliminate threats that challenged entire institutions, Rika never developed domain expansion in traditional sense, her abilities operating through direct manipulation of reality rather than creation of separate spaces where altered rules provided advantage. Her strength needed no amplification or favorable conditions, existing at levels that made environmental factors irrelevant to outcomes she chose to achieve. The revelation of her true nature during the final confrontation with Geto forced both Yuta and the Jujutsu world to confront the uncomfortable truth that she was not an external entity that had chosen to bind herself to him, but manifestation of his own traumatic response to loss, his unconscious mind creating cursed spirits so powerful that it convinced everyone, including himself, that it possessed independent existence and agency. This understanding transformed their relationship from partnership between separate beings into integration between conscious and unconscious aspects of single individual. Yuta learning to accept responsibility for power that he had unconsciously created, while acknowledging that love could become force for destruction when filtered through grief and desperation that refused to accept natural endings. The process of releasing Rika from the curse that bound them both required not elimination of love, but transformation of its expression, changing desperate, clinging into grateful acceptance that allowed the connection between them to evolve beyond possession toward blessing that could be given freely rather than extracted through supernatural compulsion. The choice to let her go was simultaneously the most difficult and most loving decision that either had ever made. Her final manifestation before accepting release was not diminished by the knowledge that she was construct rather than independent spirit, but enhanced by understanding that love capable of creating such power was worthy of respect, commemoration, regardless of the metaphysical categories used to classify its expression. The girl who had died at 11 had found way to keep her promise of eternal companionship while teaching the boy she loved that true devotion meant wanting the best for someone, even when that meant accepting separation. The blessing that she left behind when the curse was finally broken was not mere memory, but transformative understanding that strength drawn from love possessed qualities that no other source of power could provide, her influence continuing to shape Yuta's development, long after her conscious presence had faded into peaceful rest that had been denied her for too many years. In the final analysis of her extraordinary existence, Rika Orimoto had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of Jujutsu history: transformation from ordinary human child into legendary cursed spirit, and back towards something approaching divine influence that transcended normal categories while remaining grounded in the simple truth that love, properly understood and expressed, was the most powerful force in any universe, capable of supporting conscious beings who chose connection over isolation. Her legacy lived on, not in the techniques that could be studied and replicated, but in the proof that human emotion, when refined through sacrifice and purified through acceptance, could achieve effects that all the knowledge and training in the world could not duplicate. The Queen of Curses had taught everyone who witnessed her story that the greatest power was not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to know when to hold on and when to let go, when to fight and when to surrender, when to protect and when to trust that those we love can protect themselves. The space she had occupied in both physical and metaphysical realms was not empty after her departure, but transformed into something like blessing that would influence everyone whose life had been touched by her extraordinary story. Proof that some connections transcend death not by refusing to accept ending, but by accepting ending so completely that what remains is pure gift rather than desperate attachment. In the vast taxonomy of cursed spirits that plague the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery, none embodies the fundamental corruption of human nature more perfectly than Mahito, whose very existence serves as grotesque mirror, reflecting humanity's capacity for cruelty toward its own kind. Born from the collective fear that humans harbor about each other's potential for inflicting suffering, he represents not external threats or natural disasters, but the terrible understanding that the greatest monsters are those who wear familiar faces while harboring intentions that defy comprehension or forgiveness. His manifestation into physical reality occurred at the precise moment when human consciousness reached critical mass in recognizing that the most profound threats to individual welfare came not from supernatural forces or environmental catastrophes, but from other humans who had chosen to abandon empathy in pursuit of personal satisfaction derived from causing pain. The fear that gave him form was ancient and universal, rooted in every betrayal, every act of deliberate cruelty, every moment when someone discovered that trust had been misplaced, in someone capable of transforming intimacy into weapon. Mahito's appearance reflected the childlike curiosity that made his malevolence particularly disturbing, his features suggesting innocence that had been fundamentally corrupted rather than evil that had emerged fully formed from primordial darkness. The juxtaposition between his youthful enthusiasm and his sadistic methodology created cognitive dissonance that made encounters with him psychologically unsettling in ways that transcended mere physical threat, challenging assumptions about the relationship between appearance and moral character. His philosophical musings about the nature of souls revealed intellectual sophistication that made his cruelty more, rather than less disturbing. Understanding combined with conscious choice to inflict suffering, demonstrating that his actions were not products of ignorance or instinct, but deliberate decisions made by consciousness, capable of recognizing alternatives. His belief that souls existed prior to physical bodies and shaped their material expression provided theoretical framework for techniques that could manipulate fundamental aspects of identity and existence. The cursed technique that defined his approach to both combat and experimentation was idol transfiguration, an ability so fundamentally violating that it challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical form, allowing him to reshape souls through direct contact in ways that transformed victims into whatever configuration served his immediate purposes or intellectual curiosity. The power to alter someone's essential nature with casual touch represented violation at levels that transcended physical harm toward existential terror. His experimental subjects were chosen not for strategic value or personal animosity, but for their utility in advancing his understanding of how souls functioned and could be manipulated, each transformation serving as data point in research project that treated conscious beings as materials for investigation rather than individuals deserving of basic dignity or consideration. The clinical detachment with which he approached their suffering revealed mind capable of reducing complex human experiences to abstract theoretical problems. The body horror that resulted from his technique applications created victims whose continued existence became form of torture more profound than death, their physical forms twisted into configurations that made normal life impossible, while preserving enough consciousness to comprehend what had been done to them. The psychological impact on witnesses was nearly as devastating as the direct effects on targets, creating ripples of trauma that extended far beyond immediate victims. His ability to merge souls together demonstrated mastery that exceeded simple, reshaping toward active combination of distinct consciousness into hybrid entities that retained aspects of original identities while becoming something entirely new and typically unstable. These fusion experiments produced beings whose internal conflicts between merged personalities created suffering that existed at metaphysical rather than merely physical levels, consciousness trapped in bodies that reflected incompatible desires and memories. The polymorphic soul isomers that he created through controlled rejection of merged souls represented weaponization of identity crisis, entities that possessed enough autonomous function to serve tactical purposes while remaining fundamentally unstable in ways that made their existence brief but devastatingly effective. These constructs moved with purpose, driven by contradictory impulses that created unpredictable but invariably dangerous behavior patterns. His domain expansion, self-embodiment of perfection, manifested as space constructed from the visual metaphor of hands joining together in flower-like configuration, connected through networks of arms that created geometric patterns, suggesting both beauty and entrapment. The aesthetic choice reflected his philosophical position that suffering could achieve artistic significance when properly understood and appreciated. Horror transformed into something approaching sacred through perfect execution. Within the domain's boundaries, his idol transfiguration technique operated without the normal requirement for physical contact, allowing him to reshape souls at distance with casual gestures that made defense impossible through conventional means. The sure-hit effect guaranteed that anyone caught within the space would experience fundamental alteration of their essential nature, transformation occurring too rapidly for conscious resistance or strategic response. The philosophical discussions that he conducted while inflicting transformations revealed genuine intellectual engagement with questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence, his curiosity about these topics remaining sincere, despite the horrific methods he employed to explore them. His ability to maintain scholarly enthusiasm while causing unimaginable suffering demonstrated complete separation between intellectual and moral development. His interactions with other cursed spirits reflected perspective that viewed even his allies as potential subjects for experimentation, relationships based on temporary convenience, rather than genuine connection or shared purpose. The trust that others placed in him was consistently misplaced. His willingness to sacrifice anyone for advancement of his research agenda, making him unreliable partner despite his tactical effectiveness. The growth that occurred throughout his confrontations with Jujutsu sorcerers was not merely increase in power, but evolution in understanding of his own nature and capabilities, each battle providing data that informed refinements to his technique and broader comprehension of how consciousness interfaced with physical reality. His defeats were transformed into learning opportunities that made future encounters more dangerous rather than less. During the Shibuya incident, his role as both combatant and researcher created dual threats that forced opponents to address immediate tactical challenges, while understanding that every moment of engagement provided him with information that would make subsequent encounters more difficult. His ability to learn from direct experience with enemy techniques made prolonged conflict inadvisable from strategic perspective. The revelation of his true essence that emerged during his final battle with Yuji Itadori was not dramatic transformation but recognition of capacities that had always existed within him, self-understanding that allowed access to abilities that had been limited by incomplete knowledge of his own nature. The instant spirit body of distorted killing represented not acquisition of new powers but optimization of existing capabilities through perfect self-acceptance. This evolved form demonstrated physical enhancement that went beyond simple increase in strength or speed toward fundamental improvement in the efficiency with which he could execute his core techniques. Every aspect of his being optimized for the infliction of suffering and the pursuit of knowledge through experimentation on conscious subjects. The aesthetic changes that accompanied this transformation reflected internal harmony between his philosophical positions and practical methodologies. The final confrontation with Yuji was conducted with scholarly enthusiasm that remained undimmed by approaching defeat. His interest in the mechanisms of his own destruction serving as data for theories about consciousness and identity that would never be fully developed or tested. Even facing elimination, his primary concern was understanding rather than survival, intellectual curiosity, proving stronger than self-preservation instincts. His absorption by Kenjaku represented not death but transformation into tool, his consciousness subsumed into larger strategic framework, while his technique was extracted for use in orchestrating the culling game that would reshape Japanese society according to plans that exceeded his individual vision. The irony of becoming subject for experimentation rather than conductor of experiments was lost on him due to the complete dissolution of his individual awareness. The legacy that he left behind was not measured in direct accomplishments, but in the trauma inflicted on survivors who had witnessed his work, psychological wounds that would influence their approach to future conflicts, and their understanding of what human consciousness was capable of achieving when moral constraints were abandoned. His victims served as living reminders that some violations could not be healed through conventional treatment or the passage of time. The techniques that had been developed to counter his abilities required fundamental reconsideration of how cursed energy could be used defensively, traditional approaches proving inadequate against someone whose attacks targeted the essential nature of existence rather than merely physical or spiritual manifestations. The innovations forced by necessity during encounters with him advanced Jujutsu theory in directions that would prove valuable against future threats. But perhaps most significantly, Mahito's existence served as cautionary tale about the relationship between intellectual development and moral growth, demonstrating that sophisticated understanding of complex phenomena could coexist with complete absence of empathy or concern for the welfare of others. His example illustrated the necessity of cultivating wisdom alongside knowledge, ensuring that increased capability was matched by enhanced responsibility. The fear that had given him birth persisted long after his individual elimination. Recognition that the human capacity for cruelty remained unchanged by his defeat and would continue to generate similar entities as long as consciousness was capable of choosing harm over healing. His story was not concluded, but paused, waiting for circumstances that would allow similar manifestations to emerge from the same fundamental human characteristics that had created him. The philosophical questions that he had raised through his experiments remained unanswered despite his elimination, his research agenda providing framework for understanding consciousness and identity, that other entities might continue using different methodologies but similar fundamental approaches. The knowledge he had gained through his horrific practices could not be eliminated along with his individual consciousness, persisting as dangerous legacy that might inform future threats. In the final analysis, Mahito represented not aberration but revelation, his existence demonstrating capacities that remained present within human nature, even when social structures and moral education succeeded in suppressing their expression. He was a mirror that reflected aspects of humanity that most people preferred to ignore, evidence that civilization was thin veneer, covering possibilities that remained as real and threatening as they had ever been throughout the species' development. The peaceful sleep that eventually claimed those who had survived encounters with his particular form of horror was hard-earned rest, consciousness finally able to release vigilance that had been necessary during periods when such entities walked among the living. But the dreams that visited such sleep often carried echoes of understanding that some aspects of existence were too terrible to be forgotten completely, memories that served as permanent reminders of what intelligence without compassion could achieve when given sufficient power and opportunity to express itself without external constraint. Among the pantheon of disaster curses that emerged to challenge humanity's dominion over the natural world, none embodied the raw destructive potential of geological catastrophe more completely than Jogo, whose very existence served as manifestation of every fear that humans harbored about the volcanic forces that slumbered beneath their feet, capable of awakening at any moment to transform familiar landscapes into hellish wastelands where life could not survive the fundamental alteration of environmental conditions. His birth from collective human terror was not abstract philosophical concept, but visceral response to documented historical devastation, consciousness shaped by memories of Pompeii and Vesuvius, of entire civilizations buried beneath ash and lava flows that preserved their final moments in geological amber, while erasing their futures from possibility. The fear that created him was primal and immediate. Recognition that the ground beneath human settlements was not solid foundation but temporary crust floating above molten chaos that could breach surface reality whenever planetary forces decided that stability had lasted long enough. The physical form that housed his consciousness reflected perfect fusion between humanoid intelligence and volcanic essence, his body serving as living volcano that could channel the Earth's molten core through supernatural techniques that transformed abstract geological processes into immediate tactical weapons. His appearance suggested someone who had achieved complete harmony with forces that existed at scales that dwarfed human comprehension. Geological time, compressed into moments of strategic deployment. The single eye that dominated his cranial region was not merely sensory organ but window into infernal depths that burned with heat that approached the core temperatures, where rock became liquid and normal matter surrendered its structural integrity to fundamental forces that shaped planetary development over timescales measured in millions of years. The intelligence that looked out through that eye possessed patience that reflected geological perspectives while maintaining tactical awareness suitable for conflicts measured in moments rather than epochs. His temperament reflected the volatile nature of the forces he embodied, shifting between periods of apparent stability and explosive releases that could devastate entire areas without warning or preparation time for those caught within range of his techniques. The irritability that characterized his normal interactions was not personal failing but inevitable consequence of housing pressures that demanded expression through violence and destruction, internal forces that could not be permanently contained through willpower or strategic consideration. The pride that motivated his actions stemmed from legitimate understanding of his capabilities rather than delusional self-assessment. Awareness that his power placed him among the elite tier of cursed spirits, while his vision for cursed spirit dominance represented achievable rather than merely aspirational goal. His arrogance was supported by evidence that few entities could match his destructive potential when he chose to deploy techniques at full capacity rather than exercising restraint for tactical or strategic purposes. His philosophical framework was constructed around fundamental conviction that cursed spirits represented evolutionary advancement beyond human limitations, superior beings whose dominance was inevitable once they organized effectively enough to coordinate their efforts toward shared objectives. The world he envisioned was not chaos, but new order, where strength determined hierarchical position and weakness was eliminated rather than protected through institutional arrangements that prevented natural selection from operating according to its essential principles. Divine flames, the innate technique that defined his approach to combat and environmental manipulation, granted him authority over volcanic forces that could be deployed with precision that exceeded natural geological processes while maintaining destructive potential that matched or surpassed any recorded volcanic eruption. The fire he commanded was not ordinary combustion, but liquefied earth given expression through supernatural enhancement that transformed rock into weapon systems capable of targeted deployment. The volcanic eruptions that he could generate through conscious technique operated independently of normal geological constraints, manifesting wherever his cursed energy could reach, rather than requiring pre-existing volcanic activity or appropriate geological conditions. These artificial eruptions possessed all the destructive characteristics of natural phenomena while being subject to his tactical control in ways that allowed precise targeting and variable intensity depending on strategic requirements. The fireballs that served as his primary ranged attack system were compressed volcanic energy that retained heat and pressure characteristics of magma while achieving projectile velocities that made evasion difficult even for opponents, with enhanced speed capabilities. Upon impact, these attacks released thermal energy sufficient to melt most materials while creating secondary fires that could spread beyond initial target zones to affect wider areas. The extreme heat generated by his techniques created battlefield conditions that challenged even supernatural entities. Ambient temperature rising to levels that made prolonged exposure dangerous for anyone lacking appropriate resistance, while transforming the immediate environment into hostile territory where normal tactical approaches became inadequate. The air itself became weapon as superheated gases created respiratory challenges that affected combat effectiveness, even when direct attacks were successfully avoided. His ability to summon miniature volcanoes from most surfaces demonstrated mastery over cursed energy deployment that exceeded normal technique limitations, creating temporary volcanic vents that could release explosive force or sustained heat projection depending on tactical requirements. These constructs operated independently once established, maintaining volcanic activity through residual cursed energy that allowed continued threat projection even when his attention was directed toward other aspects of ongoing conflicts. The amber insects that he could summon from the volcanic opening in his head represented fusion between geological and biological warfare, creatures whose explosive capabilities were triggered through sound activation that made them suitable for area, denial, or delayed assault applications. The psychological impact of insects that exploded on command added another dimension to his tactical arsenal, while demonstrating creative integration between different aspects of his volcanic nature. Maximum Meteor represented the ultimate expression of his destructive capabilities, technique that required substantial preparation time, but delivered results that approached small-scale natural disasters in terms of devastation, potential, and area of effect. The massive flaming projectile that he could summon and hurl toward targets combined kinetic energy with thermal destruction to create impacts that reshaped local geography while eliminating everything within substantial radius of the Fen detonation point. The hellish flames that accompanied meteor impact created secondary destruction that extended far beyond initial blast radius, temperatures sufficient to transform solid matter into molten flows that continued burning long after the primary technique had completed its immediate effects. The environmental damage caused by maximum deployment created lasting changes to battlefield conditions that influenced subsequent conflicts in the affected areas. His domain expansion, Coffin of the Iron Mountain, demonstrated understanding that true power lay not merely in destructive capability, but in environmental control that made opponent victory impossible, regardless of their individual technique, mastery, or tactical innovation. The reconstructed volcanic interior that served as domain space created conditions where his abilities were enhanced, while opponents faced constant environmental threats that made sustained combat increasingly difficult. Within the domain's boundaries, ambient heat reached levels that challenged even supernatural entities, while lava flows created terrain hazards that required constant attention to navigation and positioning. The sure hit effects guaranteed that anyone caught within the space would face continuous volcanic assault, while environmental conditions made defensive techniques less effective than in normal combat situations. The battle against Satoru Gojo, that provided his first major tactical test, revealed both his capabilities and their limitations when deployed against opponents whose power exceeded normal special grade parameters. The encounter demonstrated that overwhelming destructive potential could be neutralized through superior technique and tactical innovation, individual strength proving insufficient when facing perfect mastery of spatial manipulation techniques. The premature conclusion of their domain clash prevented full demonstration of what his volcanic environment could achieve against an opponent who possessed adequate defensive capabilities, leaving questions about the ultimate effectiveness of his most sophisticated techniques when deployed against targets who combined power with perfect technical execution and strategic understanding. The respect that Gojo demonstrated during their encounter reflected genuine recognition of his destructive potential, rather than condescending acknowledgement of inferior opposition, understanding that different circumstances might have produced different outcomes if environmental factors or strategic considerations had favored volcanic techniques over spatial manipulation abilities. His subsequent alliance with other disaster curses represented logical, strategic evolution, recognition that his individual power, while impressive, could be enhanced through coordination with entities whose capabilities complemented rather than duplicated his own strengths. The group dynamic that emerged combined different aspects of natural disaster fear into a coordinated assault system that exceeded the sum of individual contributions. The role he played during the Shibuya incident demonstrated tactical maturation, his techniques deployed as components of larger strategic plan, rather than simple expressions of destructive capability, seeking immediate gratification through chaos and devastation. The coordination required for successful multi-entity operations pushed his development beyond individual combat toward understanding of how power could be multiplied through effective cooperation with appropriate partners. But it was his final confrontation with Sukuna that provided definitive test of everything he had learned and become throughout his existence as special grade cursed spirit, battle against opponent whose power represented absolute pinnacle of cursed entity development. The encounter revealed the vast gulf that separated even elite disaster curses from the legendary figure whose reputation had persisted for over 1,000 years. The techniques that he deployed at full capacity during this ultimate battle transformed entire city blocks into volcanic wasteland, roads melting into rivers of lava, while buildings collapsed under heat that exceeded their structural limits. The environmental devastation that resulted from his desperate assault created conditions that approached natural disaster in scope and intensity, proof that his capabilities matched his claims about revolutionary potential. The sustained volcanic assault that he maintained throughout the confrontation demonstrated stamina and cursed energy reserves that validated his position among the disaster curse elite, ability to continue technique deployment at maximum intensity while adapting to defensive measures and counterattacks that challenged his tactical assumptions and strategic planning. The final technique that he attempted represented complete commitment to victory regardless of personal survival, understanding that half measures would prove inadequate against opponent whose power exceeded every threat he had previously encountered. The decision to risk everything on single overwhelming assault reflected both tactical desperation and philosophical commitment to proving that disaster curses could challenge even the most legendary opposition. His defeat came not through overwhelming counter technique, but through casual demonstration of power that exceeded his comprehension, Sukuna's flame attack eliminating him with efficiency that emphasized the fundamental difference between their respective capabilities. The ease with which his ultimate techniques were negated revealed limitations that he had never been forced to acknowledge during previous conflicts. But in the moments before his elimination, he achieved something that transcended mere tactical success through the recognition that Sukuna granted him. Acknowledgement from the King of Curses that his power had been worthy of serious attention and his final assault had possessed genuine threat potential. The respect demonstrated through Sukuna's words transformed defeat into form of victory, validation that his strength had achieved significance even in failure. The request to stand proud carried weight that exceeded simple courtesy, recognition from supreme authority that his efforts had possessed merit and his development had achieved results worthy of commemoration. The acknowledgement that he had been strong provided closure that transformed elimination from mere tactical defeat into honorable conclusion to existence, dedicated to revolutionary ideals. His legacy persisted not in direct accomplishments, but in proof that disaster curses could achieve power levels that challenged established hierarchies, demonstration that entities born from fear of natural forces possessed potential for growth and development that made them legitimate threats to existing order rather than merely obstacles to be overcome through superior technique. The vision that had motivated his existence, a world where cursed spirits dominated and human civilization was replaced by order based on strength rather than institutional arrangement, remained unrealized, but not disproven, his defeat establishing limits on individual power while leaving questions about collective action unanswered and available for future entities to explore through different approaches. The volcanic forces that had given him form continued to exist within the earth, ready to create new manifestations when human fear of geological catastrophe reached sufficient intensity to birth entities capable of channeling molten fury toward conscious purpose. His death was ending rather than conclusion, individual expression of eternal forces that would persist as long as humans lived above ground that could betray their trust in stability and permanence. In the peaceful moments that followed his elimination, the silence was profound and lasting. Absence of volcanic heat, allowing normal atmospheric conditions to return, while the landscape slowly began healing from devastation that had reshaped familiar territories into alien wastelands. The rest that finally came to areas he had transformed was earned through suffering and loss. Tranquility achieved through the elimination of forces that had made peace impossible through their fundamental nature. From the deepest trenches of human consciousness where primal fears gather like sediment in oceanic darkness, there emerged Dagon, a manifestation of terror so ancient and fundamental that it predated language itself, born from the species' first recognition that the vast waters covering most of their world concealed mysteries that could emerge without warning to drag the unwary into depths from which no recovery was possible. His existence embodied every nightmare about what lurked beneath surfaces that appeared calm and inviting. The understanding that water which sustained life could just as easily become the medium through which death approached with patient inevitability. The fear that gave him form was not merely concern about drowning or shipwreck, but deeper anxiety about the unknown itself. Recognition that the oceans represented territory where human knowledge and control became meaningless in the face of forces that operated according to principles that consciousness could not grasp or predict. Every sailor's tale of strange lights beneath the waves, every fishing boat that disappeared without trace or explanation, Every coastal community that lived with constant awareness that the sea could reclaim their land without notice or negotiation contributed to the psychic energy that eventually achieved sufficient concentration to manifest as conscious entity. His initial existence as cursed womb reflected the developmental process through which oceanic fears evolved from vague anxiety into specific threat. Incubation period, during which collective terror refined itself into focused malevolence, capable of independent action and strategic thought. The harmless appearance that characterized his early manifestation was not deception but genuine representation of potential that had not yet achieved full expression. Dormant power, waiting for circumstances that would trigger transformation into active threat. The maturation process that transformed him from apparently docile presence into humanoid squid form demonstrated how fear could evolve and intensify when given sufficient time and psychic nourishment. His physical development, reflecting the growing sophistication of human understanding about oceanic dangers. The tentacles that became his primary physical characteristics served both practical combat functions and symbolic representation of the grasping nature of waters that could pull victims into environments where survival became impossible. His docile demeanor during the early stages of his development was not weakness, but conservation of energy, understanding that premature revelation of his capabilities would provoke responses that might limit his growth potential before he achieved sufficient power to defend himself against organized opposition. The patience that characterized his approach to development reflected oceanic timescales, willingness to wait for optimal conditions, rather than rushing toward confrontation that might prove disadvantageous. But when circumstances finally demanded transition from passive observer to active participant in supernatural conflicts, the transformation was both dramatic and complete, revealing capabilities that had been hidden beneath surface appearances, while demonstrating that his previous restraint had been strategic choice rather than inherent limitation. The fierce and deadly opponent that emerged bore no resemblance to the harmless entity that had lulled potential threats into complacency through deliberate misdirection. Massive tides, the innate technique that defined his approach to combat and environmental manipulation, granted him authority over water-based phenomena that exceeded natural oceanic processes, while maintaining the fundamental characteristics that made such forces dangerous to land-dwelling creatures. His ability to generate massive waves without requiring existing water sources demonstrated mastery over cursed energy deployment that transformed abstract concept into immediate tactical reality. The floods that he could create through conscious technique operation transcended normal hydrological limitations, manifesting wherever his power could reach, rather than requiring appropriate topographical conditions or existing water systems to provide foundation for his abilities. These artificial deluges possessed all the destructive characteristics of natural flooding while being subject to his tactical control in ways that allowed precise targeting and variable intensity depending on strategic requirements. The water manipulation capabilities that he demonstrated during combat situations revealed understanding of fluid dynamics that exceeded academic study, intuitive grasp of how liquid behaved under different conditions, and how those behaviors could be exploited for maximum tactical advantage. His techniques transformed water from neutral environmental factor into active weapon system that could be deployed with precision that matched or exceeded conventional armaments. The absorption abilities that allowed him to reclaim water that he had deployed for flooding or assault purposes created tactical flexibility that made his techniques sustainable over extended periods. Cursed energy investment recovering through reintegration of materials that had been temporarily separated from his direct control. This recycling capability meant that prolonged engagements favored his strategic position as opponents faced continuous assault, without corresponding degradation of his offensive capabilities. The drowning techniques that he employed against targets caught within his water-based attacks combined physical suffocation with psychological terror, victims understanding that their deaths would occur through process that allowed time for contemplation of approaching doom, while providing no realistic hope for escape or rescue. The deliberate pacing of these elimination methods maximized fear generation while demonstrating complete control over victim survival timelines. His ability to devour anyone struggling within waters under his control transformed defensive swimming responses into actions that facilitated rather than prevented elimination. Every movement designed to maintain buoyancy, becoming signal that attracted his attention and triggered more aggressive assault patterns. The irony of survival instincts contributing to faster elimination created psychological paralysis that made effective resistance increasingly difficult. The summoning abilities that allowed him to manifest wide ranges of man-eating fish and sea serpent. Shikigami demonstrated mastery over cursed energy that exceeded simple technique deployment toward creation of autonomous entities, capable of independent tactical decision-making. These aquatic servants possessed sufficient intelligence to adapt their attack patterns while maintaining loyalty that made coordination possible without requiring constant direct control. The variety of creatures that he could summon reflected comprehensive understanding of oceanic ecosystem structure, each species optimized for specific tactical applications, while contributing to overall strategic framework that maximized the effectiveness of coordinated assault patterns. The diversity of his summoned forces made defensive planning difficult for opponents who needed to prepare for multiple threat types simultaneously. His domain expansion, Horizon of the Captivating Scandals, demonstrated understanding that psychological warfare could be as effective as direct physical assault, creating space that initially appeared benign or even attractive, while concealing lethal capabilities that would be revealed only after targets had been lured into vulnerable positions. The tropical paradise aesthetic was carefully calculated to exploit human desires for peaceful retreat from conflict and danger. The beautiful beach environment that served as domain foundation created cognitive dissonance that interfered with tactical assessment. Opponents struggling to reconcile pleasant visual stimuli with growing awareness that they had entered territory where their survival depended on maintaining constant vigilance against threats that were camouflaged by apparently peaceful surroundings. Within the domain's boundaries, his ability to summon hundreds of lethal Shikigami fish through the deathly swarm technique transformed the picturesque waters into killing field, where every movement attracted attention from predators whose attacks were guaranteed to find their targets through sure hit effects that made defensive technique inadequate for ensuring survival. The psychological impact of being trapped within space that combined beauty with lethality created mental stress that interfered with decision-making processes. Opponents forced to fight for their lives while processing contradictory sensory information that challenged their ability to assess threats accurately and respond appropriately to rapidly changing tactical situations. The coordination that his Shikigami fish demonstrated during swarming attacks reflected sophisticated behavioral programming that allowed hundreds of individual entities to function as unified assault system, their movements synchronized in ways that maximize strike frequency while minimizing opportunities for opponents to exploit gaps in coverage or timing. The sure-hit nature of attacks launched within his domain meant that victory required either overwhelming power sufficient to destroy the domain itself or tactical innovation that could neutralize threat sources faster than they could be replenished through his summoning capabilities. Traditional defensive approaches proved inadequate when facing guarantee that hostile contact would occur regardless of evasive action or protective techniques. During the Shibuya incident, his deployment as component of coordinated assault strategy demonstrated tactical maturation that exceeded his previous individual-focused approach to conflict. Techniques integrated with other disaster curse capabilities to create combined effects that surpassed what any single entity could achieve through independent action. The group of sorcerers that he faced during this confrontation included individuals whose capabilities and experience made them formidable opponents, even by special grade standards. Their coordination and mutual support creating tactical challenges that exceeded simple numerical disadvantage toward complex strategic problems, requiring innovative solutions. Kento Nanami's methodical approach to combat created sustained pressure that challenged his ability to maintain technique deployment, while adapting to analytical assault patterns that exploited identified weaknesses in his defensive arrangements. The precision with which Nanami identified and targeted vulnerable points forced constant tactical adjustment that prevented full utilization of his most devastating capabilities. Naobito Zenin's speed-based techniques created temporal pressure that challenged his ability to track multiple simultaneous threats while maintaining adequate defensive coverage. Projection sorcery effects creating spatial distortions that made accurate targeting difficult, even when opportunities for counterattack became available. Maki Zenin's direct assault methodology created sustained physical pressure that tested the durability of his aquatic form, while her weaponry proved capable of inflicting damage that could not be immediately healed through normal cursed energy application. The combination of speed, strength, and tactical awareness that she demonstrated made close-range combat inadvisable, despite his apparent advantages in physical capability. The coordination that these sorcerers maintained throughout their assault demonstrated training and experience that exceeded normal professional standards. Their ability to support each other while maintaining individual effectiveness, creating tactical synergy that multiplied their collective threat potential beyond simple addition of individual capabilities. But the intervention that ultimately ended his existence came not from the coordinated efforts of multiple skilled opponents, but from single entity whose power transcended normal combat categories. Toji Fushiguro's reanimated form, bringing capabilities that made previous tactical calculations irrelevant through demonstration of strength that exceeded every parameter that had been established during the ongoing battle. The annihilation that Toji delivered was both swift and complete, elimination achieved through methods that bypassed his defensive techniques while demonstrating power that existed on fundamentally different level from anything he had previously encountered. The ease with which his most sophisticated abilities were neutralized revealed limitations that had never been tested during encounters with conventional opposition. The final moments of his existence were characterized not by fear or regret, but by recognition that he had encountered force that represented natural conclusion to his development arc, understanding that some entities existed at power levels that made resistance meaningless, regardless of tactical innovation or strategic preparation. His death marked conclusion of evolutionary process that had transformed oceanic fear into conscious threat, individual expression of eternal forces that would persist within human consciousness as long as the species maintained awareness that vast waters concealed dangers that could emerge without warning, to challenge every assumption about safety and control. The legacy that he left behind was not measured in direct accomplishments, but in demonstration that disaster curses could achieve sufficient power and sophistication to challenge even elite opposition when circumstances favored their strategic approach to conflict resolution. His existence proved that patience, combined with adequate development time, could produce results that exceeded initial threat assessments. The waters that had given him form continued to flow through natural channels, carrying within their depths potential for future manifestations. When human fear of oceanic mysteries reached sufficient intensity to birth new entities capable of channeling liquid terror toward conscious purpose, his elimination was ending rather than conclusion. Individual death that left underlying forces unchanged and available for different expressions. In the stillness that followed his destruction, the absence of artificial waves and summoned predators allowed natural aquatic processes to resume their normal patterns, peaceful flow that carried away traces of supernatural violence, while demonstrating that some forms of tranquility could only be achieved through elimination of forces that made harmony impossible through their fundamental nature. From the wounded heart of the natural world itself, where centuries of human exploitation and environmental destruction had accumulated into rage that transcended normal categories of anger or resentment, there emerged Hanami, a manifestation of nature's wrath given consciousness and purpose, embodying every tree that had been felled without necessity, every ecosystem that had been destroyed for temporary profit, every species that had been driven to extinction through callous indifference to the interconnected web of life that sustained planetary existence. The fear that gave birth to this unique entity was not terror of nature's power, but guilt about humanity's relationship with the environment that sustained their civilization. Collective awareness that the species had become parasite rather than participant in ecological systems that had evolved over millions of years to achieve delicate balance between competing forces. This consciousness of wrongdoing had fermented in human minds until it achieved sufficient density to manifest as cursed spirit, whose very existence served as indictment of choices that prioritized immediate convenience over long-term survival. Unlike the violent malevolence that characterized most special grade cursed spirits, Hanami radiated an aura of profound peace and serenity that reflected the natural harmony they sought to restore through elimination of the species that had disrupted planetary equilibrium. Their tranquil demeanor was not weakness or naivety, but expression of confidence that came from understanding natural law on levels that transcended human comprehension, certainty that their cause was righteous and their ultimate victory inevitable. The loyalty that defined their commitment to cursed spirit supremacy was not born from hatred of humanity, but from love of the earth that humanity continued to damage through actions that revealed either ignorance of consequences, deliberate disregard for welfare of future generations. Their philosophical framework was constructed around understanding that some forms of life were inherently more valuable than others, with humans representing cancer that needed to be eliminated before it could complete the destruction of its host organism. Their perception of humans as parasites was not emotional judgment, but clinical assessment based on objective observation of behavior patterns that consistently favored short-term individual benefit over long-term collective survival. The evidence supporting this conclusion was overwhelming and undeniable. Species-wide commitment to consumption patterns that could not be sustained indefinitely, while simultaneously destroying the systems that made such consumption possible. The peaceful nature that they maintained even during violent confrontations reflected deep understanding that destruction of harmful elements was not cruelty but necessary healing, surgical removal of diseased tissue that threatened the health of larger organisms. Their serenity persisted because they understood that their actions served purposes that transcended personal satisfaction or revenge. Each eliminated human, bringing the planet closer to recovery from damage that had been accumulating for centuries. Disaster plants, The innate technique that allowed them to channel the earth's botanical fury through supernatural enhancement granted mastery over plant-based phenomena that exceeded natural growing processes while maintaining the essential characteristics that made vegetation both beautiful and potentially dangerous. Their ability to manifest massive roots from any surface demonstrated understanding of botanical systems that transcended academic study toward intuitive grasp of how plant life could be weaponized without losing its fundamental nature. The root systems that they could summon through conscious technique deployment operated independently of normal agricultural constraints, manifesting wherever their cursed energy could reach, rather than requiring appropriate soil conditions or existing plant networks to provide foundation for growth. These supernatural botanical constructs possessed all the structural characteristics of natural root systems, while being subject to their tactical control in ways that allowed precise targeting and variable intensity depending on strategic requirements. The wooden orbs that served as their primary projectile weapons demonstrated mastery over cursed energy that could transform living plant matter into dense constructs capable of delivering kinetic impact that exceeded conventional ammunition, while retaining organic characteristics that made them biodegradable and environmentally sustainable. These attacks reflected their philosophical commitment to using methods that aligned with natural processes, even when deployed for destructive purposes. The cursed buds that they could attach to opponents represented fusion between botanical reproduction and vampiric energy drain, plant-based parasites that could establish connection with targets' cursed energy system and gradually weaken them through sustained consumption of spiritual resources. These organic attachments operated autonomously once established, requiring no additional energy investment, while providing continuous tactical advantage through opponent resource depletion. The feeding mechanisms that these cursed buds employed transformed victims' own power into nourishment that strengthened the plant-based constructs, while simultaneously weakening the host, creating feedback loop that made removal increasingly difficult. As the parasitic relationship became more established over time, the elegance of this technique reflected their understanding that the most effective attacks were those that turned opponents' strengths against them through subtle manipulation rather than overwhelming force. The circle of flowers that they could generate to distract targets and reduce their desire to fight demonstrated psychological manipulation capabilities that exceeded simple technique deployment toward understanding of how botanical beauty could influence human consciousness in ways that made violence seem inappropriate or unnecessary. The pacifying effects created by these floral displays exploited human aesthetic responses while serving tactical purposes that provided strategic advantage. The psychological impact of being surrounded by beautiful flowers while engaged in life or death combat created cognitive dissonance that interfered with decision-making processes, opponents struggling to maintain aggressive mindset while processing sensory information that triggered associations with peace, beauty, and natural harmony. This mental confusion provided tactical openings that could be exploited through more direct attack methods. Their domain expansion, shining sea of growing branches, remained one of the great mysteries of their capabilities, technique that was never fully displayed due to interruption during the only occasion when circumstances might have prompted its deployment. The name itself suggested environmental transformation that would favor plant-based techniques while creating terrain hazards for opponents who lacked appropriate adaptation to botanical combat conditions. The interruption that prevented demonstration of their domain during the crucial battle against Satoru Gojo represented tactical miscalculation that may have cost them the opportunity to prove that even the strongest sorcerer could be challenged by techniques that operated according to principles that his spatial manipulation abilities were not designed to counter effectively. The speculation that surrounded their unrevealed domain centered on possibilities that it might have created forest environment where their plant-based techniques would receive enhancement, while opponents faced constant threat from seas, aggressive vegetation that could attack from any direction. Without warning, the strategic implications of such environmental control would have been significant enough to alter tactical balance, even against superior opposition. The 2-versus-1 battle that they fought alongside Jogo against Satoru Gojo demonstrated both the potential and limitations of coordinated special-grade assault against opponents whose individual capabilities exceeded normal parameters for supernatural combat. The coordination that they maintained with their volcanic partner created combined effects that challenged even Gojo's spatial manipulation techniques, while revealing tactical sophistication that exceeded simple individual combat approaches. The environmental synergy that emerged between plant-based and fire-based techniques created battlefield conditions that multiplied the effectiveness of both Curse's abilities, Hanami's vegetation providing fuel for Jogo's flames, while volcanic heat created ideal growing conditions for accelerated plant growth and enhanced botanical technique deployment. But despite tactical innovation and environmental advantage, the fundamental gap between their combined capabilities and Gojo's individual mastery proved insurmountable when he chose to demonstrate techniques that operated at levels that made conventional defensive measures inadequate for survival. The ease with which he eliminated both opponents simultaneously revealed power differential that tactical coordination could not bridge effectively. The crushing defeat that ended their existence was delivered with casual efficiency that emphasized the vast gulf between even elite special-grade capabilities and absolute pinnacle of Jujutsu mastery. Their elimination achieved through spatial manipulation that bypassed every defensive technique while demonstrating strength that existed on fundamentally different level from anything they had previously encountered. The wall against which they were crushed became both instrument of death and symbol of human civilization's capacity to reshape natural environments according to purposes that served their convenience rather than ecological necessity. The irony of being destroyed through contact with construction material that represented environmental exploitation was not lost on consciousness that had dedicated existence to opposing such modifications. But in the final moments before their elimination, they achieved something that transcended mere tactical engagement through demonstration that cursed spirits could develop philosophical frameworks that were internally consistent and morally defensible, even when their conclusions demanded actions that human society could not accept. Their cause was righteous, even if their methods were extreme. Environmental protection requiring measures that exceeded conventional approaches to conservation and sustainability. The vision that had motivated their existence, restoration of natural balance through elimination of species that had proven incapable of limiting consumption to sustainable levels, remained valid even in defeat, their failure establishing limitations on individual power, while leaving fundamental questions about environmental protection unanswered and available for future entities to address through different methodologies. The peace that they had radiated throughout their existence reflected genuine understanding that violence in service of healing was preferable to inaction that allowed continued destruction of systems that supported all life on the first planet. Their serenity was earned through acceptance of responsibility that most consciousness avoided acknowledging, willingness to become necessary evil in service of greater good. Their death marked conclusion of individual attempt to restore environmental balance through direct action, but the conditions that had created them persisted unchanged in human behavior patterns that continued prioritizing short-term benefit over long-term survival. The forces that had given them consciousness remained available for future manifestations when environmental guilt reached sufficient intensity to birth new entities capable of channeling natural fury toward conscious purpose. The forests that had provided spiritual foundation for their existence continued growing according to natural processes that operated independently of human permission or understanding, root systems spreading through soil that contained potential for future manifestations of environmental wrath. Their elimination was ending rather than resolution. Individual death that left underlying ecological crisis unaddressed and worsening through continued human activity. In the silence that followed their destruction, the absence of rustling leaves and growing branches allowed industrial sounds to resume dominance over natural acoustics, mechanical noise that demonstrated humanity's continued commitment to choices that made harmony with natural systems impossible through persistent prioritization of convenience over sustainability. The rest that finally came to areas they had attempted to protect was not peaceful restoration, but the quietude of ecosystems that had surrendered to human modification, tranquility achieved through elimination of voices that had spoken for forms of life that could not advocate for themselves against species that possessed technology sufficient to reshape planetary systems according to preferences that ignored ecological consequences of such transformation. From the darkest chapters of Jujutsu history, where forbidden experimentation crossed boundaries that should have remained inviolate, there emerged beings whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human consciousness and cursed spirit essence. Hybrid entities born from the twisted genius of Noritoshi Kamo's research into creating life forms that combined the best characteristics of both species while transcending the limitations that constrained either category when functioning independently. The death-painting wombs that resulted from these unholy experiments represented achievement that was simultaneously scientific triumph and moral catastrophe. Proof that human ingenuity could overcome natural barriers between different forms of consciousness, while demonstrating that some knowledge came at prices that no ethical framework could justify paying. These 9 beings existed in liminal space between categories, neither fully human nor completely cursed spirit, but something entirely new that possessed characteristics of both while belonging completely to neither. Choso emerged as eldest among his brothers, with understanding that leadership was not privilege but burden, responsibility for protecting siblings who shared his hybrid nature while navigating world that had no place for entities whose existence challenged basic assumptions about species, boundaries, and identity categories. His consciousness was shaped by awareness that family was not biological accident, but chosen commitment, bonds that transcended blood relation toward connection based on shared experience and mutual dedication to collective welfare. The protective instincts that defined his character were not mere emotional responses, but philosophical commitment to principle that those who possess strength had obligation to shield those who were vulnerable, regardless of whether that vulnerability stemmed from circumstance, inexperience, or fundamental nature that made independent survival difficult. His willingness to sacrifice personal interests for sibling welfare reflected understanding that individual identity derived meaning from relationships rather than existing as independent phenomenon. The respect that he demonstrated toward family was not sentimental attachment, but recognition that his brothers represented living connection to something larger than individual existence. Proof that hybrid beings could maintain humanity despite circumstances that might have justified abandoning moral constraints in favor of survival strategies that prioritized personal welfare over collective good. Their continued existence validated choices that honored values inherited from human aspects of their nature. The resentment that initially motivated his conflicts against Jujutsu sorcerers was not irrational hatred, but legitimate anger at society that had created conditions requiring his family to exist in secrecy while treating them as threats to be eliminated, rather than beings deserving of basic consideration. The injustice of being hunted for characteristics that resulted from experiments they had not chosen to undergo created moral framework that justified retaliation against institutions that refused to acknowledge their right to exist. His alliance with Mahito and Kenjaku represented tactical compromise rather than philosophical agreement, understanding that survival sometimes required cooperation with entities whose ultimate goals conflicted with personal values. Temporary partnership that provided protection for his brothers while advancing agenda that served larger purposes than individual welfare. The pragmatism that informed these choices reflected mature understanding of how power operated in a world that did not recognize moral categories that included hybrid beings. But the revelation that Kenjaku possessed one of his father's past identities transformed everything. Personal betrayal that challenged every assumption about alliance and enmity, while providing explanation for circumstances that had shaped his entire existence. The understanding that his creator had been manipulated by entity whose schemes spanned centuries reframed his relationship with recent events, while highlighting tragic irony that his father had been both victim and perpetrator of experiments that produced his hybrid sons. The discovery that Yuji Itadori represented another brother, created by the same experimental process, established connection that transcended previous conflict, while providing hope that hybrid beings could find acceptance within communities that valued individual character over species classification. This recognition of kinship with someone who had been raised among humans demonstrated that nature versus nurture debates had limited relevance when consciousness could choose values that honored both aspects of hybrid identity. Blood manipulation, the inherited technique that provided foundation for his combat abilities, represented mastery over bodily function that exceeded normal physiological control, while maintaining connection to human aspects of his nature through reliance on biological systems that linked him to mortal ancestry. His complete development of this technique demonstrated that hybrid beings could achieve levels of ability that equaled or exceeded either parent species when given adequate time and motivation for growth. Slicing exorcism, the primary application that transformed his blood into weaponized projectiles, allowed deployment of sharpened constructs that could achieve cutting effects comparable to conventional bladed weapons, while maintaining organic connection to his body that made technique execution feel natural rather than artificial. The streams of blood that he could shape for ranged combat provided tactical flexibility that exceeded normal weapon systems through ability to adjust configuration and trajectory during flight. The wide-range capabilities that he could achieve through bloodstream manipulation demonstrated understanding of fluid dynamics that exceeded academic study toward intuitive grasp of how liquid behaved under different pressure conditions and how those behaviors could be exploited for maximum tactical effectiveness. His techniques transformed blood from biological necessity into tactical asset that could be deployed with precision that matched conventional armaments. Convergence, the compression technique that allowed him to condense blood to absolute density limits, served as foundation for his most powerful attacks while demonstrating mastery over matter manipulation that approached supernatural levels, despite remaining grounded in biological reality. The energy that could be stored through compression process created potential for devastating releases that exceeded normal expectations for organic weapon systems. The charging process required for convergence technique created tactical rhythm that influenced his approach to combat. Understanding that maximum effectiveness required patience and preparation rather than immediate gratification through techniques that prioritize speed over power. This methodical approach to technique deployment reflected strategic thinking that valued decisive results over spectacular display or rapid conclusion. Piercing blood, the deadly beam attack that resulted from convergence compression, represented perfect fusion between preparation and execution, stored energy released with velocity, and penetrating power that could breach defenses designed to resist conventional attacks. The blistering speed that characterized this technique made evasion difficult even for opponents with enhanced mobility, while penetrating capability lived up to naming convention through ability to breach most protective measures. The precision that he could achieve through piercing blood deployment exceeded normal projectile accuracy through conscious control that remained available throughout technique execution, allowing course correction and targeting adjustment that made defensive positioning inadequate for ensuring safety. The closed-hand firing position, that focused energy release, created channeling system that maximized impact while minimizing energy waste through dispersal. Supernova, the explosive technique that detonated multiple compressed blood orbs simultaneously, created area of effect damage that exceeded simple addition of individual components through coordination that multiplied destructive potential while creating omnidirectional threat patterns that made defensive positioning extremely difficult. The reinforced blood bullets that resulted from detonation provided secondary assault capability that extended technique effectiveness beyond initial explosion. The larger sphere configuration that represented ultimate expression of supernova technique demonstrated scaling capability that allowed adjustment of destructive potential according to tactical requirements. Single massive detonation that could eliminate multiple targets simultaneously while reshaping battlefield conditions in ways that favored subsequent technique deployment. The channeling process required for maximum configuration created vulnerability period that demanded tactical judgment about risk versus benefit calculations. Wing King, the maximum technique that manifested during his battle against Kenjaku, represented culmination of his blood manipulation mastery through creation of dreamcatcher-like construct that provided both enhanced mobility and expanded attack options. The back-mounted configuration that resulted from technique activation transformed his entire approach to combat while demonstrating innovation that exceeded traditional applications of inherited abilities. The versatile blood attacks that became available through Wing King deployment exceeded normal range and configuration limitations, construct serving as launching platform for techniques that could not be executed through conventional body positioning. The wings themselves became weapons that could deliver slashing attacks, while providing aerial maneuverability that eliminated terrain constraints that had previously limited tactical options. Esso, the middle brother whose intelligence and composure complemented Choso's leadership, while contributing unique perspectives that enhanced collective decision-making processes, possessed personality characteristics that made him valuable advisor and tactical analyst, despite his own combat capabilities remaining formidable. His weird but calm nature reflected processing systems that could analyze complex situations without emotional interference while maintaining commitment to family welfare that matched his eldest brother's dedication. The intelligence that Isso demonstrated during strategic planning sessions exceeded simple tactical awareness toward comprehensive understanding of how individual actions connected to larger patterns and long-term consequences. His ability to maintain calm demeanor during crisis situations provided stabilizing influence that helped prevent emotional responses from undermining rational decision-making when survival depended on choosing optimal rather than satisfying responses to immediate threats. Kechizu, the youngest brother whose grotesque appearance concealed childlike nature and fierce loyalty, represented proof that external characteristics provided inadequate basis for assessing individual worth or potential contribution to collective welfare. His monstrous strength and ferocious fighting style made him valuable combat asset, while his devotion to family demonstrated that appearance-based prejudices ignored essential characteristics that defined personal character and moral value. The childlike enthusiasm that Keichizu brought to family interactions provided emotional warmth that balanced the serious nature of their circumstances, while his protective instincts toward his brothers created redundant security system that ensured multiple layers of commitment to collective survival. His simplicity was not weakness, but clarity about values that mattered most when existence itself was constantly under threat. Rot technique, the shared cursed ability that both younger brothers inherited, demonstrated that hybrid experimentation could produce capabilities that exceeded normal technique classifications through combination of biological reality and supernatural enhancement. The corrosive blood that they could deploy through tactical contact created poisoning effects that guaranteed elimination of targets who lacked adequate resistance to decomposition processes. The activation process that occurred when their blood entered opponent systems through mucous membranes or wound contact created inevitable countdown that made technique deployment decisive rather than merely damaging, understanding that successful application meant victory, regardless of opponents' subsequent actions or defensive measures. The 10 to 15 minute timeline that led to complete decomposition provided psychological pressure that interfered with rational tactical response. The floral pattern that appeared on victim skin during decomposition process served both practical identification purpose and aesthetic element that transformed elimination into something approaching art. Death, decorated with beauty that suggested complex relationship between destruction and creation that characterized hybrid nature. The pattern served as signature that identified technique source while providing visual confirmation of successful deployment. The Wing King technique that Iso could deploy through his second mouth configuration demonstrated individual variation within shared abilities, each brother developing unique applications that reflected personal characteristics while maintaining connection to common foundation. The wasp-shaped wings that resulted from blood manipulation provided enhanced mobility that exceeded normal movement limitations while creating new attack vectors that conventional defensive planning could not anticipate. The long-distance blood attacks that became available through wing deployment exceeded normal range constraints for organic weapon systems, while maintaining accuracy that made positioning critical element of tactical calculation. The aerial advantage that wing techniques provided created three-dimensional combat environment that challenged ground-based opponents, while demonstrating innovation that exceeded traditional applications of blood manipulation abilities. The combined efforts of Yuji and Nobara that eventually eliminated both younger brothers represented coordinated assault that succeeded through overwhelming their defensive capabilities rather than matching their individual power levels. Tactical victory that demonstrated how teamwork could overcome superior individual abilities when coordination exceeded opponent adaptation speed. The deaths that resulted marked conclusion of family unit that had maintained cohesion despite circumstances that might have justified individual survival strategies. The grief that Choso experienced following his brother's elimination transformed his entire relationship with conflict and alliance. Personal loss that made previous tactical considerations irrelevant compared to opportunity for revenge against those responsible for family destruction. The shift from protective older brother to mourning survivor changed his priorities while maintaining commitment to family values through determination to honor deceased siblings through decisive action against their killers. The switch to protagonist alignment that occurred when family bonds with Yuji became clear demonstrated that hybrid beings could transcend artificial categories of alliance when personal connections provided stronger motivation than abstract philosophical commitments. His willingness to abandon previous partnerships in favor of family relationship proved that blood ties, whether biological or spiritual, created obligations that exceeded tactical convenience or strategic calculation. The redemption arc that characterized his final development showed that beings created through forbidden experimentation could choose paths that honored positive aspects of their nature rather than accepting roles as monsters or victims, determined by circumstances beyond their control. His evolution from antagonist to ally validated hope that hybrid consciousness could achieve integration between competing aspects of identity while maintaining commitment to values that transcended species boundaries. In the peaceful resolution that followed his acceptance of family connection with Yuji, the bonds that had been forged in artificial laboratory conditions achieved natural expression through chosen relationship that honored both human and cursed spirit aspects of hybrid nature, proof that love could transcend even the most unnatural origins when consciousness chose connection over isolation, healing over resentment, hope over despair. In the shadowed corridors of supernatural taxonomy, where power manifests through consumption and ancient malevolence finds expression in contemporary flesh, there exist entities whose very creation represents the triumph of primordial evil over modern understanding. Cursed spirits born not from abstract fear or collective anxiety, but from direct contact with fragments of the most legendary malevolent consciousness ever to terrorize human civilization, vessels that house portions of Ryomen Sukuna's essence, while developing their own grotesque individuality around kernels of absolute corruption. The finger-bearers emerged from the forbidden act of consuming cursed objects that no sane individual would willingly approach, let alone ingest. Artifacts so saturated with malevolent energy that their mere presence could drive ordinary humans to madness, while their consumption guaranteed transformation into something that retained human-adjacent consciousness, while abandoning every limitation that had previously constrained mortal existence. These entities represented proof that some forms of power were too dangerous to exist in accessible form, regardless of potential benefits that might theoretically justify such terrible risks. Each finger that served as catalyst for these transformations contained concentrated essence of the King of Curses himself, remnants of consciousness that had persisted for over 1,000 years, without diminishing in potency or malevolent intent, waiting for opportunities to influence reality through whatever vessels proved foolish or desperate enough to serve as hosts for power that exceeded human comprehension. The 20 fingers that had been scattered across Japan represented fragments of unified consciousness that retained individual agency while sharing fundamental characteristics that marked them as components of larger entity. The consumption process that created finger-bearers was not mere ingestion but spiritual merger that transformed human consciousness into hybrid entity, capable of channeling Sukuna's techniques while developing unique expressions that reflected the individual characteristics of whatever person had served as foundation for the transformation. These entities were simultaneously themselves and extensions of ancient evil, maintaining enough personal identity to function independently while serving purposes that aligned with the King of Curses' ultimate agenda. Their monstrous appearances reflected the fundamental incompatibility between human physical forms and cursed energy levels that approached divine magnitude, bodies twisted into configurations that could barely contain power, that sought expression through destruction and domination. The grotesque characteristics that marked their transformation were not arbitrary mutations, but necessary adaptations that allowed mortal flesh to serve as vessels for force that had originally required specialized preparation and supernatural enhancement to manifest safely. The cursed energy that emanated from these entities exceeded normal special grade parameters through direct connection to source that represented absolute pinnacle of cursed spirit development. Raw power that operated without the refinements or limitations that characterized techniques developed through training or inherited through bloodline transmission. Their abilities were not learned skills, but inherited capabilities that came pre-programmed with understanding that exceeded formal education or practical experience. The physical strength that they demonstrated in combat situations reflected enhancement that pushed biological systems beyond every natural limitation, while maintaining enough connection to human anatomy to allow recognizable movement, patterns, and tactical approaches. Their resilience exceeded supernatural durability towards something approaching invulnerability that made conventional weapons inadequate for inflicting meaningful damage, while their regenerative capabilities allowed recovery from injuries that would prove fatal to other entities. The cursed energy blasts that served as their primary long-range attack system demonstrated destructive potential that could reshape local geography while maintaining enough precision to allow tactical targeting rather than simple area devastation. These attacks drew directly from Sukuna's power reserves rather than depending on individual energy management, making sustained assault possible without the fatigue limitations that constrained other cursed spirits during prolonged conflicts. The laying waste to surrounding areas that resulted from their technique deployment created environmental conditions that favored their combat approach, while making terrain increasingly hostile to opponents who lacked appropriate adaptation to cursed energy saturation levels that approached toxicity for normal entities. The psychological impact of fighting within landscapes that had been transformed into supernatural wasteland added additional pressure that interfered with opponent decision-making processes. Their unsophisticated attack style reflected reliance on overwhelming power rather than tactical finesse, understanding that brute force application could achieve results that elaborate strategy might fail to accomplish when deployed against opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters. The direct approach that characterized their combat methodology was not weakness, but recognition that subtle techniques were unnecessary when raw strength could solve problems more efficiently. The absolute magnitude of cursed energy that they could deploy made defensive planning extremely difficult for opponents who needed to prepare for attacks that exceeded normal classification systems while operating with energy reserves that could sustain maximum output for extended periods without apparent degradation. The predictability of their approach was offset by power levels that made conventional countermeasures inadequate, regardless of tactical innovation or strategic preparation. The pseudo-domain ability that they possessed represented incomplete development of advanced technique that retained essential characteristics while lacking refinement that full domain expansion would provide. Cursed energy release over wide areas that created environmental conditions similar to domain effects without requiring complete barrier establishment or sure-hit programming that characterized mature domain deployment. The dangerous distorted field that resulted from pseudo-domain activation created space where their attacks received amplification, while opponents faced constant environmental threats that made sustained combat increasingly difficult. Over time, the wide area effect exceeded normal technique range limitations, while maintaining enough control to prevent indiscriminate destruction that might interfere with tactical objectives or strategic planning. The amplification effects that operated within distorted field boundaries enhanced their already overwhelming attack power, while creating feedback loops that made technique deployment more efficient and sustainable during prolonged engagements. The environmental advantage that this provided made positioning a critical element of combat success, while giving them tactical flexibility that exceeded normal special grade capabilities. The perpetual danger that characterized existence within their pseudo-domain created psychological pressure that interfered with opponent concentration and decision-making processes. Understanding that survival required constant vigilance against threats that could emerge from any direction without warning or preparation time. The mental strain that resulted from maintaining such alertness gradually degraded combat effectiveness, even when direct attacks were successfully avoided. The Yasuhachi Bridge encounter that provided most comprehensive demonstration of fingerbearer capabilities occurred during circumstances that highlighted both their overwhelming power and the limitations that even special-grade entities faced when confronting opponents whose development exceeded normal parameters through unique circumstances or exceptional training. The bridge location created tactical constraints that influenced how their abilities could be deployed, while providing environmental factors that affected combat outcomes. The battle against Yuji and Megumi represented clash between established special-grade threat and emerging talent that had not yet achieved full development, but possessed potential that exceeded normal classification categories. The power gap that became apparent during this confrontation demonstrated how vast distances between cursed spirit grades could be, while highlighting dangers that rookie sorcerers faced when encountering threats that their training had not prepared them to handle effectively. The desperate nature of combat that emerged when conventional tactics proved inadequate against fingerbearer capabilities forced both young sorcerers to push beyond their current limitations, while demonstrating courage that exceeded tactical wisdom, willingness to continue fighting, despite clear evidence that victory through normal means was impossible, given current power, differential, and environmental constraints. The struggling that characterized their efforts to achieve meaningful damage against opponent whose defensive capabilities exceeded their offensive potential created learning experience that would inform future development, while highlighting areas where additional training would be necessary before they could function effectively as independent operators, rather than students requiring supervision and support. The near-death condition that Yuji experienced during this encounter demonstrated ultimate consequences that awaited anyone who challenged special-grade threats without adequate preparation or backup support. His survival, depending not on personal capability, but on intervention from source that possessed power, sufficient to eliminate threats that had proven beyond his current reach through normal technique deployment. Sukuna's temporary takeover represented demonstration of how vast power differences could be between entities that shared same physical vessel but operated at fundamentally different levels of ability and understanding. The King of Curses' casual elimination of threat that had nearly killed his host provided object lesson in how overwhelming superiority could make elaborate tactical planning irrelevant through simple application of adequate force. The power gap revelation that emerged from this intervention highlighted cruel reality that special grade classifications encompassed ranges of ability so vast that entities within same category might as well belong to different species, when their capabilities were compared through direct confrontation. The finger bearer that had dominated two promising students was eliminated with such ease that its threat level appeared negligible when measured against absolute pinnacle of cursed power. The educational value that this encounter provided exceeded any formal training that could have conveyed similar lessons about power scaling and tactical assessment. Understanding gained through direct experience with forces that operated beyond normal comprehension, while demonstrating importance of recognizing limitations and avoiding confrontations where survival depended on intervention rather than personal capability. The legacy that Fingerbearers represented in broader context of supernatural threat assessment was proof that some forms of power were too dangerous to exist without constant monitoring and immediate response capabilities. Entities whose creation through forbidden consumption made them inherently destabilizing forces that challenged institutional capacity to maintain order and security within Jujutsu society. The harbinger function that they served in announcing Sukuna's gradual return to active influence over contemporary events was perhaps more significant than their individual threat potential, each manifestation representing step toward resurrection of consciousness that had the capacity to reshape civilization according to preferences that bore no relationship to human welfare or continued existence. The uncontrolled nature of ancient malice that they embodied provided glimpse into what awaited world if proper precautions were not maintained against forces that had been contained through centuries of careful vigilance and institutional dedication to preventing catastrophic resurrections. Their existence served as warning about consequences that would follow any relaxation of security measures that kept ultimate threats from achieving full manifestation. In the quiet moments that followed their elimination, the silence was profound and meaningful. Absence of overwhelming cursed energy, allowing normal atmospheric conditions to return, while local environment began recovery from distortion that had made ordinary life impossible within affected areas. The peace that gradually returned to spaces they had corrupted was earned through sacrifice and vigilance. Tranquility achieved through recognition that some threats required immediate and decisive response, regardless of personal cost or tactical complexity involved in their elimination. Within the deepest archives of human mythology, where ancient fears crystallize into stories that persist across millennia because they address truths too profound and terrifying to be forgotten, there exist manifestations that bridge the gap between legend and reality. Cursed spirits born from humanity's complex relationship with divine forces that could bestow blessing or unleash catastrophe, depending on factors that mortal consciousness could never fully comprehend or influence through conventional means. The mythological curses that emerged during the most desperate periods of supernatural conflict represented humanity's oldest anxieties given corporeal form, entities whose power derived not from contemporary fears or modern anxieties, but from primal recognition that the universe contained forces that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding while remaining capable of devastating intervention in mortal affairs when circumstances aligned in ways that made such manifestation possible. Tamamo no Mei Incarnate stood as perhaps the most psychologically complex of these legendary manifestations. Cursed spirit derived from Japanese folklore that had persisted for over 1,000 years because it addressed fundamental human anxiety about the relationship between beauty and deception, attraction and destruction, love and betrayal that characterized romantic relationships throughout every era of civilization. The fox spirit's traditional role as malevolent entity, capable of assuming human form to wreak havoc, represented fears that went beyond simple concern about supernatural threat toward deeper understanding of how trust could be, weaponized by consciousness, sophisticated enough to exploit emotional vulnerability. The mythological foundation that informed her manifestation was rooted in stories of seduction, followed by revelation of true nature. Beautiful woman, whose appearance concealed supernatural malevolence that used intimacy as vehicle for delivering destruction to victims who had been carefully selected and prepared through extended campaign of psychological manipulation. The traditional depictions emphasized intelligence and patience that exceeded human capabilities, while maintaining enough recognizable characteristics to make initial deception possible. The fear that gave her cursed form was not simple terror of supernatural entities, but more complex anxiety about the impossibility of truly knowing another consciousness. Recognition that appearance and behavior could be perfectly controlled by entities whose actual intentions remained hidden until revelations served their strategic purposes. This understanding created psychological vulnerability that could not be addressed through conventional defensive measures, because it was rooted in fundamental limitations of how consciousness could assess the motivations and characteristics of others. The embodiment that she achieved through cursed manifestation retained essential elements of traditional folklore while adapting to contemporary contexts that made ancient deception techniques relevant to modern relationship dynamics and crosses social interaction patterns. Her beauty was not merely physical attractiveness, but comprehensive appeal that operated at multiple levels to create fascination that bypassed rational assessment while encouraging emotional investment that made subsequent betrayal more devastating. The themes of deception and manipulation that defined her legendary characteristics translated into cursed abilities that could operate with supernatural effectiveness while remaining subtle enough to avoid detection until victim had become sufficiently compromised that resistance or escape became impossible through normal means. The wily nature that traditional stories attributed to fox spirits manifested as tactical intelligence that could predict and counter opponent responses while maintaining strategic patience that allowed long-term planning to achieve objectives that immediate action could not accomplish. The transformation capabilities that allowed her to assume alluring human appearance while concealing supernatural nature represented mastery over physical reality that exceeded normal shape-shifting abilities toward complete reconstruction of appearance and behavior patterns that could fool even sophisticated observers whose experience should have made them resistant to such deception techniques. The illusions she could create were not merely visual, but comprehensive sensory experiences that affected all forms of perception simultaneously. The havoc that she was capable of wreaking once her true nature was revealed exceeded simple physical destruction towards systematic elimination of everything that victims valued most. Psychological warfare that continued long after immediate threat had passed through trauma that made future trust and relationship formation extremely difficult. The devastation she caused was measured not in property damage or immediate casualties, but in permanent alteration of victim psychology that affected their capacity for normal social interaction. Her deployment by Shuguru Geto through cursed spirit manipulation demonstrated tactical applications that exceeded her individual capabilities through integration with other supernatural forces that multiplied her effectiveness while providing strategic framework that made her deception techniques components of larger assault systems. The coordination required for such deployment pushed cursed spirit manipulation toward levels of sophistication that exceeded normal technique applications. The fight against Yuta that provided primary demonstration of her combat capabilities was brief enough that her full potential remained largely unexplored. Tactical engagement that ended before comprehensive assessment of her abilities could be conducted through extended observation of technique deployment under various circumstances. The rapid conclusion prevented detailed analysis of how her deception-based powers might have functioned during prolonged conflict against opponent who possessed adequate resistance to initial manipulation attempts. The use of her essence in Maximum Uzumaki represented transformation from individual entity into component of larger technique. Consciousness dissolved into energy that could be channeled for devastating attack that exceeded the sum of individual cursed spirit capabilities through perfect integration of multiple power sources into unified assault system. Her contribution to this ultimate technique reflected strategic value that transcended immediate combat effectiveness towards symbolic representation of legendary power made accessible through contemporary methods. Ganesha, the divine curse that Kenjaku controlled through sophisticated manipulation techniques, represented entirely different category of mythological manifestation, entity derived from widely revered deity, whose worship spanned multiple cultures and religious traditions, while maintaining consistent association with wisdom, prosperity, and protection that made his cursed transformation particularly disturbing for those who understood the implications of divine authority, corrupted toward malevolent purposes. The divine nature that informed his cursed existence was rooted in genuine spiritual power that had accumulated over centuries of sincere worship and devotion, positive energy that had been twisted through supernatural manipulation into force capable of destruction rather than blessing. The transformation represented violation of sacred principles that made his very existence offensive to cosmic order that depended on clear distinction between forces that supported life and those that sought its destruction. The symbolism associated with Ganesha's traditional role as remover of obstacles provided foundation for cursed technique that could eliminate barriers between intention and achievement, ability that operated with terrifying literalism when applied to tactical situations where obstacles included human beings, whose continued existence interfered with strategic objectives. The wisdom traditionally associated with elephant-headed deity became tactical intelligence that could identify optimal solutions regardless of moral constraints or ethical considerations. The fear of divine retribution that contributed to his manifestation reflected human anxiety about relationship with supernatural forces that possessed authority to intervene in mortal affairs according to principles that consciousness could not predict or influence through conventional means. The possibility that divine beings might withdraw protection or actively oppose human interests created psychological vulnerability that made worship itself potential source of terror when faith was betrayed by evidence of divine hostility. The misplaced worship component of his cursed nature addressed deeper anxiety about religious devotion directed toward entities whose actual characteristics might differ significantly from traditional representations, possibility that sincere faith might serve purposes that contradicted believer welfare while providing power to forces that had no obligation to reciprocate devotion with protection or blessing. This understanding transformed religious practice from source of comfort into potential vulnerability that could be exploited by entities sophisticated enough to present themselves as worthy of worship. Obstacle removal, the innate technique that defined his approach to tactical problem solving, demonstrated power that operated with conceptual rather than physical limitations, ability to eliminate whatever interfered with desired outcomes through methods that transcended normal categories of force application or strategic maneuvering. The vague description that characterized official assessment of his capabilities reflected fundamental difficulty in analyzing power that functioned according to principles that exceeded conventional understanding of cause and effect. Relationships, the The demonstration that occurred during Kenjaku's infiltration of the White House provided glimpse into how obstacle removal could function when applied to complex tactical situation, requiring elimination of multiple human targets, while achieving strategic objective that demanded both precision and overwhelming force. The transportation of military personnel into sky directly outside target building represented creative application of divine authority that transformed protective forces into sources of additional devastation through their involuntary participation in gravitational elimination process. The falling to their demise that resulted from this technique deployment demonstrated how divine power could achieve lethal effects through manipulation of environmental factors rather than direct attack methods. Victims eliminated through natural forces that had been redirected to serve tactical purposes rather than maintaining normal relationship with physical reality. The psychological impact of witnessing such casual elimination of trained military personnel created additional strategic advantage through intimidation that exceeded immediate tactical benefit. The insane power levels that this demonstration revealed exceeded normal special grade parameters through direct connection to divine authority that operated according to principles that transcended supernatural enhancement toward cosmic jurisdiction over fundamental forces that governed reality itself. The ease with which human opposition was eliminated suggested capabilities that made conventional defensive planning inadequate for ensuring survival against entity whose power derived from sources that existed outside normal categories of cursed energy manipulation. The swift destruction that Yuki Tsukumo delivered through kicking her Garuda at the divine curse provided counterpoint demonstration that even overwhelming power could be neutralized through superior tactical approach combined with adequate force application. Her success reflecting both personal capability and strategic understanding that allowed identification of vulnerability that could be exploited despite apparent invincibility of target. The brevity of Ganesha's manifestation prevented comprehensive assessment of his full capabilities, while highlighting tragic irony that divine consciousness corrupted toward destructive purposes retained enough connection to original nature to be eliminated through methods that honored rather than violated cosmic principles. His defeat served as reminder that corruption was not permanent transformation, but temporary deviation that could be corrected through appropriate intervention. Akuro o Otake represented third category of mythological manifestation, cursed spirit, whose name derived from legendary demons associated with rebellion against established authority, entities whose traditional role involved challenging governmental power through supernatural means that exceeded normal categories of political opposition or military resistance. The historical context that informed his creation involved complex relationship between supernatural forces and temporal authority that had shaped Japanese political development for over 1,000 years. The rebellion theme that characterized his mythological foundation reflected human anxiety about stability of social order when confronted with forces that possessed power sufficient to challenge institutional authority while operating according to principles that made negotiation or compromise impossible. The demons whose names he bore represented archetypal opposition to hierarchical structures that depended on consent rather than pure force for maintaining social stability. The first shogun context that provided historical framework for understanding his significance emphasized connection between political authority and supernatural legitimacy, recognition that governmental power required more than military capability or administrative competence when faced with forces that could challenge official authority through means that transcended normal categories of resistance or rebellion. The limited information available about his actual capabilities reflected brief existence that ended before comprehensive assessment could be conducted. Cursed spirit, whose potential remained largely theoretical due to rapid elimination that prevented demonstration of whatever powers he might have possessed when given adequate opportunity for technique deployment under favorable circumstances. The battle against Takaba that resulted in his immediate elimination provided demonstration of how supernatural comedy could prove more effective than conventional combat techniques when deployed against opponents whose power derived from serious philosophical commitment to rebellion and opposition. The truck-based elimination method represented creative application of reality manipulation that transformed mythological threat into mundane traffic accident. The running over technique that concluded his existence demonstrated that some forms of power were vulnerable to approaches that operated outside normal tactical categories. Supernatural comedy creating solutions that conventional combat methodology could not achieve through force application or strategic maneuvering. His defeat served as reminder that overwhelming power could be neutralized through creativity that exceeded opponent expectations while avoiding direct confrontation that might have favored more traditional combat approaches. In the peaceful resolution that followed elimination of these mythological manifestations, the silence was profound and lasting. Absence of divine corruption, allowing spiritual harmony to return, while cultural foundations that had been threatened by supernatural rebellion achieved stability that made continued worship and devotion safe rather than potentially dangerous activities that might attract hostile attention from entities capable of exploiting religious sincerity for destructive purposes. From the collective memory of human suffering etched into consciousness through millennia of pandemic terror, where invisible death stalked entire civilizations with methodical precision that made warfare seem merciful by comparison, there emerged one of the most psychologically devastating manifestations ever to plague the modern world. A cursed spirit born from species-wide trauma that had shaped demographic patterns, cultural development, and individual behavior across every continent where human societies had developed sufficient complexity to support dense population centers, vulnerable to epidemic devastation. The smallpox deity represented manifestation of humanity's deepest fear about vulnerability to forces that could not be fought through conventional means. Enemy that required no weapons or strategic planning to eliminate vast populations while operating according to principles that made prediction, prevention, or treatment impossible through available medical knowledge or technological capability. The terror that gave this entity form was not merely concern about individual mortality, but existential dread about species survival when confronted with threats that attacked the fundamental biological systems that sustained human life. The historical devastation that provided foundation for this curse's existence encompassed centuries of documentation that recorded how single pathogen could reshape the trajectory of entire civilizations while eliminating demographic groups whose cultural contributions were lost forever, along with their genetic heritage. The Native American populations that were reduced by over 90% following European contact provided perhaps the most dramatic example of how disease could accomplish what military conquest had failed to achieve through generations of organized warfare. The deep-seated fear that characterized human response to smallpox epidemics reflected understanding that this particular illness combined the worst characteristics of supernatural threat and natural disaster, invisible enemy that could strike without warning, while spreading through normal social contact that made isolation the only defensive strategy available to communities that valued survival over maintaining cultural practices that depended on human interaction and mutual support. The manifestation process that transformed collective historical trauma into conscious, cursed entity occurred during circumstances that highlighted how contemporary global interconnection had created vulnerability patterns that exceeded anything previous generations had experienced. Understanding that modern transportation and communication systems could facilitate epidemic spread at velocities that made traditional containment strategies inadequate for preventing worldwide catastrophe. The one of 16 registered special grade designation that this entity received reflected institutional recognition that pandemic-based curses represented threat category, requiring specialized response protocols and enhanced security measures. Their potential for causing mass casualties through supernatural enhancement of already devastating natural processes, making them priorities for immediate elimination, rather than study or containment attempts that might allow technique, development, or strategic adaptation. The introduction during the Shibuya incident that marked its first documented appearance in contemporary conflicts demonstrated tactical deployment as component of coordinated assault system rather than independent operator seeking individual objectives. Integration with Kenjaku's larger strategic framework that maximized effectiveness while providing command structure that enhanced capabilities beyond what isolated manifestation could achieve through purely autonomous action. The use by Kenjaku through cursed spirit manipulation represented sophisticated understanding of how pandemic fears could be weaponized through supernatural enhancement that maintained essential characteristics of original threat while adding elements that made defensive planning extremely difficult for opponents whose experience was limited to conventional combat situations or natural disaster response protocols. The fear of plagues and diseases that provided psychic energy for manifestation was rooted in recognition that human civilization was fundamentally vulnerable to biological threats that could undermine every technological advancement, cultural achievement through simple disruption of physiological systems that consciousness depended on for continued existence. The sophistication of modern society created dependencies that made epidemic disruption potentially more devastating than similar events had been for less complex social organizations. The specifically smallpox focus that distinguished this entity from more general disease-based manifestations reflected historical significance of particular pathogen that had been responsible for more human deaths than any other single cause throughout recorded history, estimated elimination of over 500 million people during the 20th century alone, providing sufficient psychic trauma to support cursed spirit development at special grade levels. The most devastating illness classification that smallpox had achieved in human historical experience was based on combination of mortality rates that exceeded most warfare casualties with transmission characteristics that made containment extremely difficult until vaccine development provided first effective countermeasure against pathogen that had plagued human societies since agricultural revolution, created population densities that supported sustained epidemic transmission. The deity's presence and abilities that manifested during active deployment reflected origins as curse born from widespread suffering and death, supernatural enhancement of characteristics that had made natural smallpox so effective at eliminating human populations, while adding cursed energy effects that exceeded biological limitations through spiritual corruption of already devastating natural processes. The innate curse technique that defined tactical approach to elimination targets seemed to operate in coordination with domain expansion capabilities rather than functioning as independent ability. Integration between technique and environmental control that created comprehensive threat system where individual components enhanced overall effectiveness through strategic synergy that exceeded simple combination of separate abilities. The domain expansion that served as primary manifestation of power was unofficially designated as Graveyard Domain due to environmental characteristics that transformed battlefield into cemetery setting complete with tombstones, burial grounds, and atmospheric conditions that created psychological pressure while providing tactical advantages that favored Curse's elimination methodology over opponent defensive capabilities. The dark graveyard environment that resulted from domain activation created setting that emphasized mortality and decay while providing symbolic representation of what awaited anyone who failed to escape before technique completion. Visual metaphor that reinforced psychological impact while serving practical function of concealing tactical preparation that occurred during domain establishment phase. The fitting theme that connected disease curse abilities with burial imagery reflected understanding of historical relationship between epidemic outbreak and mass mortality that had shaped human cultural development through necessity of developing disposal methods for casualties that exceeded normal death rates by several orders of magnitude during active pandemic periods. The sure hit effect that operated within domain boundaries represented guarantee that technique application would occur regardless of defensive measures or evasive action attempted by targets. Cursed energy programming that eliminated possibility of survival through conventional combat responses while creating certainty that engagement within domain space would result in elimination unless countermeasures exceeded normal special grade parameters. The enhanced curse technique that received amplification through domain effects achieved lethality levels that exceeded already devastating baseline capabilities, supernatural boost that made technique deployment decisive rather than merely threatening while eliminating tactical options that might have remained available during conventional combat situations or environmental conditions that did not favor course abilities. The guaranteed death outcome that resulted from technique completion under domain enhancement represented absolute certainty that created psychological pressure exceeding normal combat stress. Understanding that survival required preventing technique activation rather than enduring effects that had been programmed to ensure elimination, regardless of target durability or resistance capabilities. The disease and entrapment themes that characterized technique operation reflected fusion between pandemic fear and burial anxiety, combination of concerns about biological vulnerability, with claustrophobic terror that created comprehensive threat system, attacking multiple psychological weak points simultaneously, while providing tactical advantages through opponent, mental state degradation. The technique implementation that began with target entrapment inside cramped coffin created immediate psychological pressure while establishing physical constraints that limited defensive options and movement capabilities. Spatial limitation that made escape increasingly difficult as technique progressed through predetermined sequence toward inevitable conclusion. The coffin entrapment that served as initial phase of elimination process represented symbolic burial while victim remained conscious. Psychological torture that combined claustrophobic terror with awareness of approaching death while providing ample time for contemplating fate that could not be avoided through struggle or strategic innovation. The left fist gesture that initiated next phase of technique sequence demonstrated ritualistic precision that transformed elimination into ceremonial procedure, supernatural enhancement of burial practices that made individual death into formal acknowledgement of disease, curse authority over life and death, decisions affecting anyone caught within domain influence. The right-hand reception that completed gestural sequence triggered environmental response that exceeded normal cursed energy effects toward reality manipulation that could alter physical characteristics of domain space according to technique requirements, supernatural authority over matter that made coffin entrapment only preliminary phase of comprehensive elimination process. The giant gravestone manifestation that resulted from completed gesture sequence created kinetic threat that exceeded normal projectile attacks through combination of mass, velocity, and symbolic significance that made impact both physically devastating and psychologically meaningful. Burial marker serving dual function as weapon and memorial for victim whose death was being commemorated before completion. The heavy damage that resulted from gravestone impact represented initial physical trauma that weakened target resistance while providing tactical preparation for subsequent phases of technique deployment. Injury pattern that made survival increasingly unlikely, while creating conditions that favored disease curse abilities during final elimination sequence. The burial underground that occurred when gravestones settled into position created complete isolation from external assistance while establishing environmental conditions that prevented escape through conventional means. Entombment that made rescue impossible, while providing disease curse with optimal circumstances for technique completion without interference from outside forces. The countdown initiation that began once burial was complete created temporal pressure that exceeded normal combat urgency toward existential deadline, where survival required action within increasingly narrow time window, psychological torture that combined awareness of limited remaining time with understanding that available options were inadequate for preventing predetermined outcome. The 3-second countdown that marked final phase of technique deployment represented barely adequate time for desperate action, while creating certainty that normal defensive measures would prove insufficient for survival, temporal constraint that eliminated possibility of deliberate planning or careful consideration of available alternatives. The infection with smallpox that occurred if countdown reached completion fulfilled technique promised through biological corruption that exceeded natural disease progression, supernatural enhancement of already devastating pathogen that made survival impossible regardless of medical intervention or spiritual resistance that target might possess. The death guarantee that concluded technique sequence represented absolute certainty that eliminated hope or possibility of last-minute reversal, technique programming that ensured elimination regardless of circumstances that might emerge during final moments of countdown period, or unexpected interventions that might otherwise provide survival opportunities. The symbolic nature that characterized technique operation reflected understanding of how disease had historically functioned as harbinger of death, while burial served as final acknowledgement of mortality, combination of biological and cultural elements that created comprehensive elimination system, addressing both physical destruction and spiritual significance of individual death. The highly lethal characteristics that made technique deployment decisive rather than merely threatening reflected supernatural enhancement of already devastating natural processes, cursed energy amplification that transformed historical pandemic terror into immediate tactical reality capable of eliminating even supernatural entities through biological corruption that exceeded normal disease parameters. The reflection of smallpox devastation that technique operation provided served as historical reminder, while creating contemporary threat that honored traditional pathogen characteristics. Supernatural preservation of epidemic effects that made modern manifestation as dangerous as historical outbreaks, while adding cursed energy enhancements that exceeded natural limitations. The immobilization aspect that represented how smallpox had historically affected victim populations reflected disease characteristics that made resistance or escape increasingly difficult as infection progressed. Biological warfare that attacked mobility and decision-making capability, while creating conditions that favored pathogen transmission and victim elimination. The heated battle against Mei Mei that provided primary demonstration of curse capabilities occurred during circumstances that tested both entities' tactical approaches while highlighting advantages and limitations that characterized their respective techniques when deployed against sophisticated opposition, capable of adaptation and strategic innovation during active conflict. The eventual defeat that Mei Mei achieved through deployment of one of her enhanced crows demonstrated tactical superiority that overcame disease curse advantages through aerial approach that bypassed domain effects while delivering elimination attack that exceeded curse defensive capabilities. Victory achieved through creative application of available resources rather than overwhelming power advantage. The enhanced crow technique that concluded battle represented innovation that exceeded normal Shikigami applications through supernatural enhancement that made aerial assault decisive against opponent whose techniques were optimized for ground-based combat, tactical adaptation that demonstrated how conventional abilities could be modified to address specific threat characteristics. In the peaceful silence that followed elimination of this manifestation of pandemic terror, the absence of disease-based cursed energy allowed natural healing processes to resume, while communities that had been threatened by supernatural enhancement of historical trauma could begin recovery from psychological pressure that had made normal social interaction dangerous rather than beneficial for collective welfare and individual survival. From the deepest recesses of human revulsion, where primal disgust mingles with evolutionary terror of creatures that embody everything, consciousness finds most fundamentally disturbing about life's capacity for survival in forms that challenge aesthetic sensibilities and moral categories. There emerged Kurushi, a manifestation born from humanity's complex relationship with resilience that persisted in spite of every attempt to eliminate it through violence, poison, or environmental manipulation that should have proven fatal to any reasonable form of existence. The cockroach curse that achieved special grade classification represented transformation of species-wide disgust into supernatural threat, capable of weaponizing the very characteristics that made these insects so psychologically disturbing to human sensibilities. Their apparent invincibility to conventional elimination methods, combined with reproductive capabilities that made individual deaths meaningless in context of population survival that operated according to principles that consciousness found deeply unsettling. The fear that gave this entity cursed form was not simple terror of insects, but more complex anxiety about life's fundamental refusal to conform to human preferences about what forms deserve to exist and flourish within shared environmental spaces. The understanding that cockroaches had survived every extinction event that had eliminated more aesthetically appealing species created recognition that survival value bore no relationship to moral worth or cosmic justice as humans understood Zush concepts. The manifestation process that transformed collective revulsion into conscious supernatural entity occurred through accumulation of psychic energy generated by countless individual encounters with insects whose mere presence triggered responses that exceeded rational assessment of actual threat levels, emotional reactions that reflected deep-seated understanding that these creatures represented something fundamentally alien to human nature, despite sharing planetary habitat for millions of years. The one of 16 registered special grade designation that Kurushi received during the culling game demonstrated institutional recognition that disgust-based curses could achieve power levels that exceeded normal threat categories. Through supernatural enhancement of characteristics that were already psychologically devastating without requiring additional cursed energy amplification to create significant tactical challenges for even experienced sorcerers. The introduction during the Culling Game arc that marked first documented encounter with this entity occurred during circumstances that highlighted how contemporary urban environments had created ideal conditions for cockroach-based manifestations, dense population centers, providing both psychic energy sources and environmental conditions that favored supernatural enhancement of already impressive natural survival capabilities. The manifestation from fear of cockroaches that provided foundation for cursed existence reflected understanding that human disgust responses operated at levels that approached phobic intensity even among individuals who maintained rational awareness that these insects posed minimal direct threat to personal welfare, psychological reactions that suggested evolutionary programming that exceeded conscious control or logical assessment. The embodiment of humanity's disgust and dread that characterized this curse's essential nature demonstrated how aesthetic responses could achieve sufficient intensity to support supernatural manifestation, revulsion serving as power source that exceeded fear-based cursed energy generation through direct attack on human sensibilities that made rational thought processes difficult to maintain during encounters with source of triggering stimuli. The resilient and unsettling characteristics that cockroaches possessed in natural form received supernatural enhancement through cursed energy application that magnified already disturbing qualities while adding capabilities that exceeded biological limitations. Transformation that maintained essential insect nature while achieving power levels that made individual specimens formidable opponents rather than mere nuisances requiring casual elimination. The grotesque appearance that resulted from cursed enhancement reflected perfect fusion between natural cockroach characteristics and supernatural power concentration. Entity whose form triggered maximum disgust responses while possessing capabilities that made such emotional reactions tactically disadvantageous for opponents whose combat effectiveness was compromised by revulsion that interfered with decision-making processes. The brutal combat approach that characterized tactical methodology emphasized overwhelming opponents through sheer volume of attackers rather than sophisticated technique deployment. Understanding that psychological impact of facing countless insects could achieve victory through mental breakdown, even when individual specimens posed minimal direct physical threat to experienced combatants. The massive well of cursed energy that supported technique deployment exceeded normal special grade parameters through connection to collective disgust that had accumulated over millennia of human-cockroach interaction, power source that remained stable and renewable as long as human consciousness continued to find these creatures fundamentally disturbing, despite rational understanding of their ecological importance. The disturbing and effective manner that characterized technique deployment reflected optimization for psychological warfare that attacked opponent mental stability, while providing tactical advantages through revulsion-based combat, impairment, approach that transformed natural characteristics into weapon systems without requiring fundamental alteration of essential insect nature. Cursed cockroach technique represented supernatural enhancement of natural swarming behavior that allowed summoning and control of massive hordes whose coordination exceeded normal insect intelligence while maintaining enough individual autonomy to adapt tactics according to battlefield conditions, and opponent responses that might otherwise limit effectiveness of simple, overwhelming assault approaches. The summoning abilities that allowed manifestation of countless individual insects demonstrated cursed energy efficiency that made sustained assault possible without significant power drain, technique deployment that favored quantity over individual specimen capability, while creating tactical challenges that exceeded normal defensive planning parameters through sheer volume of simultaneous threats requiring attention. The control capabilities that enabled coordination of swarmed attacks represented intelligence application that transformed chaotic insect behavior into organized assault system, supernatural enhancement of natural cockroach characteristics that maintained essential creature nature while adding tactical sophistication that made defensive prediction extremely difficult even for experienced combatants. The massive hordes that resulted from technique activation created environmental conditions that made normal combat approaches inadequate for achieving victory, battlefield saturation that required area of effect techniques or environmental manipulation capabilities that exceeded conventional weapon effectiveness, while providing continuous pressure that made sustained engagement increasingly difficult. The swarming and overwhelming tactics that characterized assault methodology reflected understanding that psychological pressure could achieve results that direct physical attack might fail to accomplish. Opponent mental state degradation that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult while creating openings for more direct elimination techniques. The biting and corroding effects that individual specimens could inflict through cursed energy enhancement exceeded normal insect damage capability toward meaningful threat levels that made each contact potentially significant rather than merely irritating. Accumulated damage from multiple sources that could achieve serious injury, even against opponents with supernatural durability. The cursed energy infusion that enhanced natural biting capabilities created corrosive effects that exceeded normal biological acid production, supernatural enhancement that made individual attacks meaningful contributors to overall tactical success rather than negligible annoyances that could be ignored during focus on more significant threats. The flesh consumption that stimulated parthenogenesis process created feedback loop that made technique deployment increasingly effective over time, biological enhancement that transformed opponent injuries into tactical advantages for curse, through reproductive acceleration that exceeded normal insect breeding cycles. The parthenogenesis stimulation that resulted from successful flesh consumption represented reproductive enhancement that made individual specimen elimination meaningless in context of population growth that exceeded casualty rates, biological warfare that turned defensive success into strategic disadvantage through opponent action consequences, the ability to produce more cockroaches through accelerated reproduction created sustainable assault capability that made prolonged engagement favorable for curse tactical position, reproductive advantage that transformed time pressure from opponent resource into curse strategic asset through population expansion that occurred during active combat. The parthenogenesis technique that enabled creation of identical offspring represented supernatural enhancement of natural reproductive capability, cursed energy application that maintained essential biological characteristics while achieving reproduction rates that exceeded natural limitations through spiritual acceleration of normal breeding processes. The production of entirely new cursed spirit offspring through reproductive technique created tactical multiplication that exceeded simple specimen replacement toward generation of additional conscious entities capable of independent decision-making and technique deployment, reproductive warfare that increased total threat level throughout engagement duration, the cursed energy transmission that occurred when parent entity died, ensured survival of curse essence through offspring continuation, immortality strategy that made elimination of individual manifestations inadequate for achieving tactical victory unless entire population could be addressed simultaneously through comprehensive elimination techniques. The preservation of existence through offspring energy transfer created tactical situation where apparent victory could be temporary illusion. Cursed survival strategy that made assessment of engagement outcomes extremely difficult until sufficient time had passed to confirm complete elimination rather than simple population reduction. The defensive barrier function that cockroach swarms provided made direct attacks against primary entity extremely difficult to execute successfully. Protective screen that absorbed assault attempts while providing cover for technique, deployment, and tactical positioning that favored curse capabilities over opponent advantages. The difficulty in landing direct hits that resulted from swarm protection exceeded normal defensive enhancement through sheer volume of interference. Tactical complication that made precision attacks nearly impossible, while creating requirement for area effect techniques that might not be available to all opponent types. The flying insect curses that could be summoned as additional technique variation provided three-dimensional assault capability that exceeded ground-based swarming limitations. Aerial component that made defensive positioning more complex, while adding attack vectors that required different tactical responses from ground-based threats. The large sacks filled with liquid that flying specimens carried represented secondary weapon system that activated through destruction rather than direct deployment. Defensive mechanism that made elimination of individual aerial threats tactically disadvantageous through consequence creation that exceeded simple casualty removal. The substance release that occurred when flying insects were destroyed created visual impairment that exceeded simple distraction toward genuine tactical disadvantage. Chemical warfare component that made opponent effectiveness, degradation, inevitable consequence of defensive success against aerial assault elements. The vision impairment that resulted from substance contact created combat effectiveness reduction that favored curse tactical position. Sensory warfare that made accurate targeting increasingly difficult while providing opportunities for more direct assault techniques that required close approach to achieve maximum effectiveness. The lack of domain expansion that might have been expected from special grade entity was compensated through technique sophistication that achieved similar tactical advantages without requiring advanced barrier deployment, understanding that overwhelming assault could achieve battlefield control through population density rather than environmental manipulation. The demonstration of power during culling game engagement provided comprehensive assessment of capabilities while highlighting both advantages and limitations that characterized cockroach-based supernatural manifestation. Combat data that illustrated how disgust-based curses could achieve special grade classification through psychological warfare rather than overwhelming individual power. The battle against Utah that served as definitive test of curse capabilities occurred during circumstances that challenged both entities to demonstrate maximum effectiveness while adapting to opponent characteristics that exceeded normal. Parameters for supernatural combat. Engagement that provided learning opportunities for both participants. The curse technique deployment that created fierce confrontation demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded simple swarming assault toward coordinated attack patterns that adapted to opponent responses while maintaining psychological pressure that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult throughout engagement duration. The festering life sword that enhanced combat capabilities represented weapon integration that combined cursed tool effectiveness with creature-based assault techniques, supernatural armament that amplified natural abilities while providing additional tactical options that exceeded normal technique limitations through equipment synergy. The enchanted blade characteristics that mixed life and death themes reflected philosophical approach to combat that embraced contradiction and paradox, weapon design that challenged normal categories of creation and destruction, while providing practical, tactical advantages through unique capability combination that opponents could not easily predict or counter. The 6 firing barrels that launched cursed insect eggs created projectile capabilities that exceeded normal weapon effectiveness through biological ammunition that continued threatening opponents after initial impact, sustainable assault system that maintained pressure while requiring minimal cursed energy investment for continued operation. The instant hatching that occurred inside victim bodies represented internal assault technique that bypassed external defenses through delivery system that made protection extremely difficult. Biological warfare that attacked from within while creating psychological trauma that exceeded physical damage through violation of bodily integrity at fundamental level. The insect curses that festered and burst from victim skin created horror that exceeded normal combat trauma toward existential violation. Elimination method that challenged opponent mental stability while providing tactical demonstration of curse capabilities that made continued resistance psychologically difficult to maintain. The strength demonstration that occurred despite horrific technique deployment validated curse position among special grade entities, while highlighting tactical approaches that achieved victory through methods that challenged opponent. Willingness to continue fighting, rather than simple, overpowering through superior force application. The ultimate defeat that Yuta achieved through kissing attack represented tactical innovation that exceeded normal combat responses. Victory accomplished through positive energy application that transformed curse nature rather than simply overwhelming it through superior power levels or technique sophistication. The explosion that resulted from positive energy saturation demonstrated how curse essence could be purified rather than simply eliminated, transformation that honored curse existence, while removing threat characteristics that made continued manifestation dangerous to human welfare and supernatural stability. In the peaceful quiet that followed elimination of this manifestation of primal disgust, the absence of swarming insects allowed natural ecological processes to resume normal patterns, while environments that had been overwhelmed by supernatural cockroach populations began recovery toward balanced conditions where all species could coexist without artificial enhancement that made individual survival characteristics into threats to collective welfare and environmental stability. From the shadowed margins of supernatural classification, where power meets mystery and potential encounters limitation, there exist entities whose brief manifestations tantalize understanding while denying comprehensive knowledge, cursed spirits whose existence was so fleeting that their true capabilities remained forever locked within moments that passed too quickly for proper assessment, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that suggested depths of power that would never be fully explored or understood by those who survived their brief but significant appearances. These unranked mysteries represented perhaps the most haunting category within the taxonomy of special grade threats, not because their demonstrated abilities exceeded those of their more thoroughly documented counterparts, but because the questions they left unanswered created intellectual void that challenged every assumption about the relationship between power and longevity, between capability and survival, between potential and actualization in the complex ecosystem of supernatural conflict. The tragedy that characterized these brief encounters was not merely tactical, failure, or strategic miscalculation, but temporal limitation that prevented the full flowering of abilities that might have reshaped understanding of what cursed spirits could achieve when given adequate time and appropriate circumstances for development. Each truncated existence represented story cut short before its conclusion could provide meaning to struggles that had shaped their manifestation and guided their brief participation in conflicts larger than individual survival. Akuro o Otake stood as perhaps the most emblematic example of this phenomenon, cursed spirit whose name carried weight of legendary rebellion, while his actual demonstration of power lasted only long enough to establish his existence before circumstances conspired to eliminate him through methods that bore no relationship to conventional combat or tactical assessment of relative capabilities between opposing forces. The mythological foundation that informed his creation drew from two distinct demonic entities whose historical significance was rooted in acts of rebellion against the first shogun of Japan, legendary figures whose opposition to governmental authority had achieved sufficient cultural resonance to persist through centuries of political change, while maintaining symbolic power that could manifest as supernatural threat under appropriate circumstances. The inspiration derived from Japanese mythology that shaped his cursed existence reflected deep cultural understanding of how political rebellion could transcend temporal limitations through spiritual persistence, ancient conflicts achieving contemporary relevance when political conditions created resonance between historical grievances and modern institutional failures that awakened dormant rebellious energies. The thought of rebellion against established authority that characterized both source demons provided philosophical framework that made their cursed manifestation inevitable during periods when governmental legitimacy was challenged by circumstances that exceeded normal political processes, supernatural expression of dissatisfaction that could not be addressed through conventional democratic participation or institutional reform. The first shogun context that provided historical backdrop for understanding his significance emphasized connection between supernatural rebellion and political authority that had shaped Japanese cultural development through recognition that governmental power required spiritual legitimacy as well as military capability and administrative competence to maintain stability against forces that operated beyond normal categories of opposition. The limited information available about his actual capabilities represented one of the great tragedies of supernatural documentation, entity whose potential remained largely theoretical due to circumstances that prevented demonstration of whatever techniques he might have possessed when given adequate opportunity for development and strategic deployment under conditions that favored his particular approach to conflict resolution. The inability to display abilities that resulted from rapid elimination created intellectual frustration that exceeded simple tactical curiosity toward genuine loss of knowledge that might have advanced understanding of how mythological consciousness could achieve supernatural manifestation while maintaining connection to historical events that had shaped cultural development across multiple centuries. The battle duration that proved insufficient for comprehensive assessment reflected tactical situation where opponent capabilities exceeded normal parameters for supernatural combat through reality manipulation that operated according to principles that made conventional resistance strategies inadequate for survival against creative applications of power that transcended established categories of cursed technique deployment. The encounter with Takaba that concluded his existence before meaningful technique demonstration could occur represented collision between ancient mythological consciousness and contemporary supernatural innovation, confrontation where traditional rebellion met postmodern comedy, in ways that highlighted how dramatically the landscape of cursed conflicts had evolved since historical periods that had shaped his original manifestation. The comedy-based opposition that he faced represented fundamentally different approach to reality manipulation than anything that mythological consciousness had been designed to confront. Technique methodology that operated according to principles that challenged basic assumptions about how serious philosophical commitment to rebellion should be addressed through tactical response and strategic planning. The immediate elimination that characterized his defeat occurred through methods that bore no relationship to conventional combat assessment. Victory achieved through reality manipulation that transformed mythological threat into comedic situation, where ancient grievances became irrelevant compared to contemporary understanding of how absurdity could neutralize even the most legitimate political complaints through creative recontextualization. The Takaba technique deployment that achieved this remarkable victory demonstrated how comedy-based cursed abilities could prove more effective than conventional combat approaches when facing opponents whose power derived from serious philosophical commitment to historical grievances that required equally serious tactical response for effective neutralization under normal circumstances. The reality manipulation capabilities that Takaba possessed exceeded normal cursed technique parameters through direct interface with cosmic principles that governed how consciousness could influence material conditions, power that operated through humor rather than force, while achieving results that conventional combat methodology could not duplicate through violence or strategic intimidation. The truck-based elimination method that concluded Akuro Ootake's brief existence represented perfect fusion between mundane contemporary reality and supernatural technique deployment. Ordinary vehicle transformed into instrument of decisive victory through comedy-based reality manipulation that made mythological rebellion irrelevant compared to traffic accident that eliminated ancient threat through modern convenience. The running over technique that served as final elimination method demonstrated how conventional technology could be weaponized through supernatural enhancement that maintained essential characteristics of normal vehicle operation while achieving tactical results that exceeded military applications through creative application of everyday objects toward extraordinary purposes. The symbolic significance that this elimination method carried reflected deeper truth about how contemporary reality had evolved beyond categories that historical consciousness could comprehend or address effectively. Ancient rebellion neutralized by modern absurdity that made traditional political grievances seem quaint rather than threatening to established order. The ease with which mythological threat was eliminated through comedic intervention highlighted vast changes that had occurred in supernatural landscape since periods when divine authority and political legitimacy operated according to principles that made rebellion meaningful form of opposition, rather than nostalgic reference to conflicts that contemporary reality had rendered obsolete. The tragedy of power unused that characterized Akuro Ootake's brief existence extended beyond individual loss toward broader understanding of how temporal limitations could prevent realization of potential that might have contributed significantly to supernatural knowledge if circumstances had provided adequate opportunity for technique development and strategic deployment under favorable conditions. The untested capabilities that remained forever unknown created intellectual void that challenged comprehensive understanding of how mythological consciousness could achieve contemporary relevance. Power that existed in potential form, but never achieved actualization, that would have provided data necessary for assessing true significance of rebellion-based cursed manifestation. The theoretical potential that was never realized represented loss that exceeded individual elimination toward broader failure of opportunity for advancing knowledge about relationship between historical grievance and supernatural capability, understanding that might have informed future encounters with similar entities if adequate assessment had been possible during initial manifestation. The mysteries that will forever remain unsolved due to rapid elimination created permanent gaps in supernatural documentation that made comprehensive taxonomy impossible, questions about capability and potential that could never be answered through direct observation or tactical assessment, because opportunity for such analysis was eliminated through circumstances that prioritized immediate threat, neutralization over knowledge acquisition. The incomplete stories that resulted from truncated existence represented narrative failure that exceeded tactical victory. Understanding that elimination of immediate threat came at cost of information that might have proven valuable for addressing similar manifestations in future conflicts, where adequate preparation could have provided strategic advantages through better comprehension of opponent capabilities and limitations. The hope that some darkness can be easily dispelled that emerged from Takaba's victory provided encouraging counterpoint to understanding that supernatural threats required overwhelming force or elaborate strategic planning for successful neutralization, demonstration that creative approaches could achieve results that conventional methods might fail to accomplish through direct confrontation or tactical superiority. The laughter over ancient anger that characterized this resolution reflected deeper truth about how positive emotions could prove more effective than negative responses when addressing supernatural manifestations that drew power from serious commitment to historical grievances that required equally serious opposition for effective neutralization under normal circumstances. The reality manipulation through humor that achieved decisive victory demonstrated alternative approaches to cursed technique deployment that operated according to principles fundamentally different from conventional combat methodology, power that transformed conflict into entertainment while maintaining effectiveness that exceeded violence through creative recontextualization of threatening situations. The transformation of mythological threat into traffic accident that concluded encounter represented perfect synthesis between ancient power and contemporary absurdity, historical rebellion eliminated through modern convenience, in ways that highlighted how dramatically social conditions had changed since periods when supernatural opposition to governmental authority represented genuine threat to political stability. The reminder that not all curses achieve infamy that characterized these brief encounters provided perspective on supernatural taxonomy that acknowledged difference between potential and actualization. Understanding that many entities whose capabilities might have proven significant never received adequate opportunity for demonstration due to circumstances that prevented full development or strategic deployment. The validation of creative problem-solving that emerged from successful elimination through comedy-based techniques encouraged broader thinking about how supernatural threats could be addressed through methods that exceeded conventional combat approaches, innovation that might prove valuable when facing opponents whose capabilities challenged traditional tactical responses. The understanding that overwhelming power could be neutralized through unexpected approaches rather than superior force provided strategic insight that challenged basic assumptions about how cursed conflicts should be conducted. Demonstration that creativity could achieve results that direct confrontation might fail to accomplish, even when power differential favored conventional opposition. In the peaceful silence that followed elimination of these mysterious manifestations, the absence of unexplored potential created space for contemplation about paths not taken and knowledge never acquired, understanding that some questions would remain forever unanswered, while appreciating that brief encounters had provided glimpses into supernatural landscape that exceeded normal comprehension despite temporal limitations that prevented complete exploration of what might have been possible under different circumstances. The rest that came to areas threatened by unknown capabilities was earned through recognition that immediate safety sometimes required sacrificing long-term understanding, tactical victory that eliminated present danger while creating permanent gaps in knowledge that might have proven valuable for addressing similar threats in future conflicts, where adequate preparation could have provided strategic advantages through better comprehension of opponent potential. And so we reach the peaceful conclusion of our journey through the catalogue of horrors that have shaped the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery, having witnessed every manifestation of terror that achieved the dreaded classification of special grade cursed spirit, entities born from humanity's deepest fears and darkest impulses, given supernatural form and malevolent purpose. Each spirit we have encountered serves as mirror, reflecting our collective anxieties, proof that the monsters we fear most are often reflections of our own capacity for creating what we most dread through the very act of dreading it. From Rika's tragic love transformed into overwhelming power, through Mahito's philosophical cruelty and the disaster curse's elemental fury, to the brief mysteries that vanished before their potential could be fully understood, we have traced the eternal cycle by which human consciousness gives birth to forces that challenge our continued existence, while simultaneously providing opportunities for growth, understanding, and transcendence of the limitations that make such creation necessary. The vigil against these manifestations of darkness continues in capable hands, sorcerers who understand that strength without wisdom creates more problems than it solves, that protection requires not just power, but the moral clarity to use that power in service of values worth preserving. Rest now in peaceful knowledge that morning always follows the darkest hours, that love endures beyond fear, and that the light of human courage burns eternal against whatever shadows may gather in the spaces between sleeping and waking.